There is a place on this planet where history feels thin, as if the sands themselves are hiding something. Under the blazing sun of what we now call Iraq, buried beneath broken cities and forgotten ziggurats, lie millions of tiny clay tablets. They are cracked, burned, worn by time. They look fragile, but the words pressed into them refuse to die. More than 6 millennia ago, somewhere between the waters of the Tigris and the Euphrates, a civilization appeared. Not slowly, not uncertainly. It arrived in the archaeological record almost like a revelation. One moment, scattered tribes and simple villages. The next, an entire culture already speaking in laws, numbers, maps, hymns, and star charts. They did not call themselves Sumerians. That name would come later, from the tongues of those who inherited their ruins. They called their land something far more intimate, Ki-en-Gir, the land of the noble lords. To them, this was not just a territory. It was a stage where heaven and earth overlapped. Imagine it for a moment. The air is thick with the scent of wet clay and river reeds. The flat horizon is broken by stepped platforms reaching upward, temples carved with symbols no other people on earth can yet read. At dawn, priests climb those platforms to watch the sky, not as dreamers, but as astronomers. In the streets below, merchants haggle, teachers instruct, scribes press wedge-shaped marks into fresh tablets that will outlive them by thousands of years. In our school textbooks, civilization is supposed to be a long, uneven climb. Hunter-gatherers settle down. They farm, they form villages, then cities, then states. Progress is accidental and slow, like a dim light gradually brightening. But in southern Mesopotamia, something different happened. The light did not slowly increase. It switched on. Archaeologists digging through the oldest layers of cities like Uruk and Eridu were stunned. They expected primitive scrawls, clumsy attempts at record-keeping. Instead, they found a writing system already complex. Cuneiform did not appear as random scratches. It arrived with standardized signs, conventions, grammar. Alongside it, they unearthed legal codes, contracts, detailed economic lists, even proverbs and poems. It was as if an entire intellectual world had appeared at once, already in motion. They found evidence of a society with laws and courts, where disputes over property and trade were recorded and resolved. A society with professional scribes trained in schools, students copying lines of text over and over like children in a modern classroom. A society with doctors listing symptoms and treatments, trying to understand sickness and pain. A society that tracked the movement of stars and planets with a precision that still puzzles experts today. And yet, there is something even more unsettling behind all of this. Because when modern researchers ask the obvious question, how did this happen? How did you learn all this? The answer was not one they expected. According to the tablets themselves, the Sumerians did not invent civilization. They were taught. Today we write their story as if they were simply the first humans clever enough to put it all together, the first to scratch marks into clay, the first to impose order on chaos, the first to build cities and call them sacred. But their own writings tell a different tale, one that begins not with human ingenuity, but with the arrival of something or someone else. Before we go there, linger with this strange beginning. Picture the world around 3500 BCE. Elsewhere, humanity is still largely tribal. Stone tools, oral stories, rough shelters. But in Ki-en-Gir, people are mapping the sky. They are building multi-tiered temples aligned with specific stars. They are cutting canals and organizing labor forces large enough to reshape the land. Their mathematics is based on a sexagesimal system, a base 60 framework that is the reason we have 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle today. That is not the work of a scattered village. That is the imprint of a coordinated, sophisticated mind. Their cities were more than piles of bricks. They were planned. Streets, temple districts, storage complexes, administrative centers, archives, libraries. Every transaction, every offering, every shipment, every legal case could be written down. And once something is written, it can travel across time. That is why we are listening to them now. In these clay records, we find economic orders and beer recipes sitting side by side with hymns to gods who govern the wind, the fertile earth, the depths of fresh water. We find lists of kings that stretch back into an almost unimaginable past. We find prayers whispered to beings called the Great Anunna and tales of a time before the Great Flood reshaped everything. From the point of view of modern science, this is the dawn of history. Before them is prehistory, a long night with a few flickers of cave art and scattered bones. With the Sumerians, the narrative suddenly opens like a curtain. Names, dates, events, laws. We can follow, we can read, we can argue, we can reconstruct. But the Sumerians were not standing at the beginning of their own story. If you listen closely to their texts, you hear something else, an echo of memory, a sense that they themselves were inheritors, that there was a before even for them, a before of gods, of earlier cities, of eras measured not in centuries, but in stretches of time so long our minds recoil. Even their origin name for their own civilization is telling. Ki-en-Gir was not just a land of people, it was the land of the lords of the plow and the pickaxe, the land over which higher powers presided. Repeatedly, their documents insist on one simple idea: kingship, knowledge, and order did not arise among humans independently. These things descended from heaven. To us, that sounds like mythic language, symbolic, poetic. But to them, it was history. Think of a modern person trying to explain the source of the internet to a child living in a remote village. The child sees the device, the magic of connection, but not the invisible infrastructure. Data centers, cables spanning oceans, satellites crossing the sky. If that child grows up and passes the story down orally, it might eventually sound like this. Once, beings from the sky gave us a gift of knowledge and connection. Facts become myth. Myth becomes religion, yet beneath it all lies a kernel of something real. When we stand before a display case in a museum and stare at a Sumerian tablet, we are looking at the very first attempts of a civilization to say, this is who we are. This is where we came from. This is who gave us our power. And those tablets whisper something our modern worldview is not prepared to hear. They talk about beings who came from the heavens and walked among humans, beings who taught them how to build cities, how to divide land, how to track the skies, beings whose bloodline, they claimed, ran through the veins of their earliest kings. So we have a choice. We can look away and reduce all of it to metaphor, to primitive storytelling from a people who did not know better. Or we can do something more difficult. We can take them seriously, at least long enough to ask why a culture so practical, so obsessed with contracts and measurements and precise numbers, would cloak its origin story in such extraordinary terms. Why did a people who could calculate eclipses and draw accurate maps of the night sky insist that their knowledge came from somewhere else? Why is the appearance of their civilization so abrupt, like a sudden island of light in humanity's long night? Tonight, we are going to walk with them. We will leave the safety of our accepted history and follow the path their tablets lay out, through tales of sky-born teachers, kings who lived for thousands of years, floods that reshaped the world, and a creation of humanity that sounds disturbingly deliberate. For now, hold on to one image: a lone scribe in the dim glow of an oil lamp pressing his reed stylus into soft clay. He is copying a text, older than he is, older than his city, perhaps older than any memory he can truly grasp. Line by line, he preserves a story that was already ancient in his day. He does not know that thousands of years later, strangers who do not yet exist will excavate his work and ask the same question he may once have whispered to himself. Where did all of this actually come from? Because the way this civilization appeared, complete, sophisticated, and inexplicably advanced, That is where the mystery truly begins. Where did all of this actually come from? That final question lingers like smoke in the air, refusing to fade. And in many ways, it is the perfect doorway into the next chapter, because the Sumerians themselves insisted that their civilization did not emerge naturally, gradually, or by human effort alone. They spoke of an origin that began long before their cities rose from the mud brick foundations of the southern plains. They claimed their knowledge was inherited, not discovered, received, not invented. To understand what that meant to them, we must step carefully into the earliest days of Key and Gear, a land that did not think of itself as primitive or new. In their own writings, the Sumerians described their rise with an almost startling confidence. They did not say, "We learned." They said, "We were taught," and the ones who taught them were not human. But before we reach those beings, the Anunna, the great lords, we first need to understand the world into which they supposedly descended. Around 3500 BCE, the southern Mesopotamian plain was a vast, shimmering stretch of wetlands, river deltas, marsh villages, and scattered communities of reed huts. The rivers overflowed their banks every year, leaving behind fertile soil and destruction in equal measure. Life here depended on water, its cycles, its moods, its blessings, and its punishments. The people who lived in this land had no idea they were standing at the threshold of something unprecedented, something that would change the trajectory of humanity itself. Archaeological layers tell us that before the Sumerians, this region was home to cultures like Ubaid and Uruk, but something happened roughly at the midpoint of the 4th millennium BCE. Something that cannot easily be explained by normal cultural evolution. Suddenly, the archaeological record shows an explosion of complexity, not an upward climb, a vertical leap. New forms of architecture emerged, unlike anything that had come before. Massive temples with perfect symmetry, towering platforms that required coordinated labor on a scale never witnessed in the ancient world. Markets appeared, filled with goods from distant lands, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Oman, cedar wood from Lebanon, obsidian from Anatolia. Trade routes that would take modern historians centuries to trace were already operating here, managed by people who were somehow keeping precise records of weights, measures, and transactions. Then there was the writing. Writing does not typically appear fully formed. It begins painfully slowly, scratches on bone, symbolic carvings, primitive marks representing basic ideas. But in Sumer, writing arrives as cuneiform, complex, standardized, and clearly the product of generations of refinement. Except those earlier generations are nowhere to be found. There is no pre-writing layer that explains the jump. It is as though someone handed them a finished system. This sudden mastery extended to law as well. While the famous Code of Hammurabi belongs to a later era, the Sumerians already had legal traditions that dealt with marriage contracts, property boundaries, economic disputes, inheritance rights, and even professional accountability. Their laws were not philosophical. They were practical, applied, tested, and enforced. A world of judges, litigants, and witnesses existed long before the rest of humanity even imagined such complexity. Mathematics, too, seemed to bloom overnight. They created a numerical system based on 60, a structure so efficient and flexible that we still rely on it today, not only in timekeeping but in geometry, astronomy, and navigation. Their tables of reciprocals, multiplication charts, and geometric rules form the roots of mathematics as we know it. And then there was medicine. The Sumerians cataloged symptoms, treatments, and diagnoses. They performed surgeries with bronze tools. They used antiseptics derived from plants. They recognized the difference between physical and spiritual disorders. In a world where most people still lived and died without ever seeing a healer, the Sumerians had a medical tradition that reads eerily like a precursor to modern clinical practice. But the strangest part, the unsettling part, is that they never claimed credit for any of it. In tablet after tablet, across cities separated by miles and generations, the message is the same. The great ones descended from the heavens. They gave us the gifts, They set the order. They established kingship. They taught us how to live. Even the Sumerian word for knowledge, me, is described not as a human invention, but as a set of decrees or principles transferred from divine realms to human hands. Knowledge was not discovered. It was bestowed. So what exactly did the Sumerians mean by those who descended? Were they speaking symbolically, as religious traditions often do? Or were they describing something they believed to be literal, historical, and real? This is where modern scholars become uneasy. Because if these were just poetic metaphors, the entire system of Sumerian culture becomes strangely inconsistent. They were not a people who exaggerated. They were not whimsical or abstract. Their entire worldview was built on order, administration, precision, and accounting. They tracked grain down to the last bushel. They documented sheep, goats, labor hours, temple offerings, and trade shipments with obsessive detail. Why would such a practical, detail-oriented people invent something so extraordinary to explain their own beginnings? Some argue that the sudden rise of Sumer can be explained by environmental conditions: fertile soil, access to rivers, good trade routes. But fertile soil does not produce advanced astronomy. Rivers do not teach mathematics. Trade routes do not generate writing systems with complex grammar and syntax. Others insist it was simply a moment when human creativity happened to ignite. But civilizations do not typically awaken with courts, mathematics, medicine, architecture, star charts, legal systems, and literature all at once, unless something or someone accelerated them. And this brings us to the heart of the Sumerian mystery, because the Sumerians left behind not a vague myth or scattered suggestion, but a detailed, structured account of the beings they claimed were responsible for their transformation. They called them the Anunna. Later traditions would call them the Anunnaki, those who from the heavens to earth came. These beings were not imagined as distant or symbolic. In the tablets, they walk, speak, command, argue, mate, build, and rule. They have families, rivalries, duties, and territories. They are described with features both human and not. They possess strength, brilliance, and longevity far beyond mortal limits. But before we dive deeply into the Anunna themselves, their nature, their role, their teachings, we must look closely at the first clues the Sumerians left behind. The earliest tablets, the oldest hymns, the stories of creation, kingship, and the founding of their sacred cities. Because everything the Sumerians became, every temple, every law, every calculation, every tradition, they claimed came from the moment these beings arrived. And according to their own writings, civilization did not rise from earth alone. It descended. But what exactly descended? That is where our exploration now turns. The next step leads us to the first recorded encounters between humans and those sky-born figures. Encounters the Sumerians insisted were real, and what comes next will challenge the boundaries between myth, memory, and the forgotten history of our species. The Sumerians insisted that something descended, not inspiration, not metaphor, but actual beings. And if we want to understand how a civilization could surge into existence with knowledge that seemed impossibly advanced for its time, we must follow the trail of clay tablets into the stories they recorded as history. This leads us to the earliest accounts of the Anunna, beings described not as spirits or distant gods, but as figures with agency, hierarchy, and physical presence. But before we examine who these beings were, we must understand the stage on which their story unfolds. The world before kingship, before temples, before the laws and mathematics that would define Sumer. If the Sumerians were to be believed, there was a time when the earth was still quiet, when humanity was unorganized and the land was without cities or order. Then, they said, the heavens opened. The earliest tablets speak of a moment when the bonds between heaven and earth were established. This line is repeated across multiple cities, suggesting a civilization-wide memory of a turning point, a sudden connection, a sudden transmission of authority from above to below. Their oldest creation hymns describe a time when the world was young and raw. before time itself was divided into eras. The Sumerians believed that the universe had structure, but that structure did not function until the Anunna arrived. These beings were described as radiant, strong, and brilliant. The texts compare them to towering figures whose presence altered the land around them. They traveled in groups, each with roles and responsibilities. They came, according to the tablets, to shape, to rule, to organize. And the moment they descended, everything changed. This moment is described as the installation of me, the divine decrees that govern everything: kingship, wisdom, craftsmanship, agriculture, the arts, justice, fertility, warfare, navigation, temples, and even human emotions. The Sumerians believed these decrees were not abstract ideas. They were objects, principles, forces that the Anunna carried with them and distributed among humans. Once given, these decrees made civilization possible. The first city they established, according to Sumerian texts, was Eridu. It was called the home of the noble lords. Archaeologists have uncovered layer upon layer of temples in Eridu, more than a dozen built directly on top of each other, each one larger than the last. This continuous construction suggests the site was sacred for thousands of years. To the Sumerians, Eridu was the first place where heaven touched earth. It was the spot chosen by the Anunna to begin their work. At the center of this sacred city stood the temple of Enki, a figure who played a crucial role in transferring knowledge to humanity. Enki is described in the tablets as wise, cunning, and compassionate toward mankind. He is the one who opened the mouths of the humans, meaning he gave them language and understanding. He is the one who arranged the me, the divine decrees, ensuring that humans would not remain in ignorance. From Eridu, the presence of the Anunna expanded outward. Other cities were established: Uruk, Kish, Lagash, Nippur, each assigned to a specific divine figure. These were not random settlements, but strategically designed centers of governance, astronomy, agriculture, and ritual. The layout of each city reflected a cosmic order. Temples were oriented to specific stars. Ziggurats served as symbolic stairways, connecting Earth to the sky. Administrative buildings aligned with seasonal cycles and trade routes. To the Sumerians, these cities were not human achievements, but collaborative projects between mortals and skyborn beings. And it is within this framework that the Sumerians explained their most puzzling phenomenon: kingship. The earliest tablets state bluntly, when kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. This line is foundational. It appears not in one document, but across centuries of Sumerian writing. Kingship was not seen as a human invention, but as an institution assigned by the Anunna. A king was not simply a leader. He was a representative chosen to maintain the order established by these beings. Kings did not rule by personal power. They ruled because their authority traced back to the heavens. This concept would spread far beyond Sumer, echoing into Egypt, Persia, India, China, and eventually into medieval Europe. But here, we are looking at its first appearance. And the Sumerians were clear. The divine right to rule was not metaphorical. It was literal. The earliest kings were described as semi-divine, individuals who possessed a mixture of human and heavenly blood. The tablets indicate that some of these early kings lived extraordinarily long lives. They were described as wise, powerful, and capable of feats far beyond ordinary men. And when these rulers died, they were succeeded by others chosen according to guidelines set by the Anunna themselves. Modern historians often dismiss these accounts as myth, insisting that no such beings existed. But the Sumerians did not carve their tablets for entertainment or fantasy. They wrote for administration, for record-keeping, for the preservation of practical knowledge. Why would they surround their origin story with such improbable details? Even more puzzling is that these accounts remain consistent across regions and time periods. The story does not evolve wildly. It does not degrade into chaos. It follows a structure, an order, a narrative that could only be maintained if it was deeply embedded in cultural memory. As you move through their texts, you begin to sense something. The Sumerians were not trying to convince anyone. They were documenting what they believed to be a factual history. They recorded the visits, the teachings, the instructions. They cataloged the assignments of each Anunna, who governed the waters, who governed the winds, who taught writing, who established law. They wrote of rivalries among these beings, conflicts that reshaped the world, and moments of cooperation that led to the flourishing of their civilization. But the question remains, who were these beings? And why did the Sumerians insist so adamantly that they were real? Some researchers argue that the Anunna were symbolic representations of natural forces. Others suggest they were ancestors mythologized over time. Yet these explanations fail to address the consistent physical descriptions, the detailed genealogies, the specific roles assigned to each figure, and the precise historical timeline the Sumerians attached to them. It is here, at this crossroads between archaeology and myth, that the mystery becomes deeper, because the earliest texts do not merely describe the presence of the Anunna. They describe their interactions with humanity in ways that sound eerily physical. These beings walked among humans. They taught them how to build, how to grow crops, how to track the seasons. They established the first schools, the first courts, the first observational stations for studying the heavens. And when disagreements arose, and they did, the tablets describe conflicts that involved both divine and human participants. To modern ears, this sounds impossible, but to the Sumerians, this was simply history, and buried within this history there is a thread that will guide us to one of the most controversial documents ever discovered, the Sumerian King List, a record that contains lifespans so vast they challenge every assumption we have about the past. But before we reach that extraordinary artifact, we must finish laying the foundation. We must understand the beings who taught the Sumerians everything they knew, beings whose names still echo in mythologies around the world, because the next chapter brings us face to face with them, the Anunna themselves, the ones who from the heavens to earth came. And what the Sumerians said about them will reshape everything we think we know about the origins of human civilization. To understand the world the Sumerians inherited and the beings they claimed walked among them, we must step deeper into their memory, into a time the tablets call the era before the flood. This is where the boundaries between history and myth grow thin, where the Sumerians begin to describe rulers whose reigns stretch beyond the limits of human imagination. And at the center of this ancient memory stands a document so unsettling, some archaeologists felt uncomfortable even acknowledging its implications. It is known today as the Sumerian King List. At first glance, it seems simple enough. A list of cities, kings, and the years they reigned. A political document, perhaps, meant to legitimize one dynasty over another. But when scholars began translating the numbers, they encountered something that made no sense within our modern understanding of human history. The earliest kings, the ones who ruled before the Great Flood, were said to have reigned for tens of thousands of years, not decades, not centuries, tens of thousands. One king ruled for 28,800 years, another for 36,000, another for 43,200. To us, these numbers appear impossible. Yet to the Sumerians, they were not symbolic, not poetic, not metaphors. They were exact, precise, recorded with the same meticulous care used for grain shipments and temple inventories. The King List does not wink, does not apologize, does not indulge in fantasy. It simply states the facts as they believed them. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. That line appears at the very beginning of the document, setting the tone for everything that follows. In Sumerian thought, kingship was not only a political institution, it was a sacred force, a divine right bestowed by the Anunna upon chosen individuals. And the first rulers were not ordinary humans. They were described as beings of extraordinary longevity, strength, and wisdom. Modern scholars struggle with this idea. Some argue that the numbers should be read symbolically, multipliers representing legitimacy or religious importance. Others suggest a misinterpretation of ancient numerology. But these explanations overlook a crucial detail. The Sumerians did not treat these reigns as mythic ages. They treated them as historical periods, listing them alongside later, shorter reigns in seamless continuity. To the Sumerians, there was no boundary between the world before the flood and the world after. There was only time, elongated, disrupted, reshaped by cataclysm, but still part of one unbroken story. But perhaps the most profound aspect of the King List is the pattern it reveals. The reigns before the flood are unimaginably long. The reigns after the flood shrink dramatically. It is as if something changed, not only in the world, but in the nature of those who ruled it. In the earliest era, kings were nearly immortal. After the flood, their lifespans declined, yet remained far longer than normal human lives. Across the tablets, rulers are recorded as reigning for 900 years, 600 years, 420 years, before gradually descending into lifespans closer to our own. This pattern, extraordinary longevity followed by a dramatic reduction, mirrors ancient traditions from other regions. The biblical patriarchs, who lived hundreds of years before the flood and far less afterward. Egyptian kings remembered as demigods in the earliest dynasties, Indian traditions of yuga cycles with declining lifespans, even Greek myths of the age of heroes giving way to the age of ordinary men. Different cultures, different eras, the same mysterious pattern. And at the center of this pattern stands the Sumerian belief that the earliest kings were not fully human, but carried the bloodline of the Anunna, the sky-born beings who shaped early civilization. If we accept their worldview at face value, the implications are staggering. According to the Sumerians, these early rulers were not merely human leaders, but hybrid beings, individuals whose very biology allowed them to live for millennia. Their reigns were long not because they were symbolic, but because they were fundamentally different from the humans who followed. But modern science cannot accept that possibility. So the numbers are dismissed, explained away, or relegated to the realm of myth. Yet the tablets persist, carved in clay, older than the Bible, older than the Greek epics, older than nearly all recorded history, and the Sumerians themselves left no commentary indicating doubt. To them, this was the beginning of kingship, an age when the divine and the human intermingled freely, when boundaries were thin and the world was still in its early shaping. But what was this flood that divided their eras so clearly? What was the event that reset civilization, wiped clean the early dynasties, and forced kingship to descend from heaven again? The answer lies buried not in myth, but in geology, because the Sumerian story of a great flood, preserved in the tale of Ziusudra, later echoed as Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, describes an event with details too precise to ignore, details that align disturbingly well with a real catastrophe that struck the Earth around 12,800 years ago. The Younger Dryas impact event, a sudden, violent disruption of global climate, brought megafloods, massive sea level rise, and widespread destruction. It was a moment of planetary trauma, one that could easily have erased coastal civilizations, submerged entire regions, and forced humanity into a new era of rebuilding. This global cataclysm sits outside the timeline of conventional history, yet its footprint is undeniable. And if the Sumerians carried a memory of this ancient catastrophe, preserved through oral tradition, encoded in myth, and eventually inscribed in clay, then the King List begins to make a different kind of sense. The pre-flood kings represent a world that existed before the cataclysm. The post-flood kings represent the world that emerged after it. The sharp decline in lifespans reflects a transformation of environment, biology, or perhaps the severance of direct contact with the Anunna. As we examine the next layer of Sumerian memory, we are led directly into the heart of this flood narrative. The tablets describe it with remarkable clarity, a divine warning, an ark built in secrecy, the destruction of the old world, and the preservation of knowledge for the new. But the most intriguing part is what happens afterward, the re-establishment of kingship, the rebuilding of cities, and the return of the Anunna to guide humanity into its next phase. The story of the flood, as the Sumerians tell it, is older than the biblical version by thousands of years, and the details they include raise questions modern science is only now beginning to ask about lost civilizations, forgotten eras, and cycles of destruction and rebirth. The flood is the hinge between epochs. To understand the world of the Anunna and the legacy they left, we must first step into the waters of that ancient deluge, because what was erased in that flood may be even more extraordinary than what survived. And the next chapter begins with the man the Sumerians called Ziusudra, the survivor of a catastrophe that reshaped the destiny of humanity. The story of Ziusudra does not begin with thunder or rain. It begins with a whisper, a warning carried in secrecy, spoken in the quiet space between gods and men. The Sumerian tablets describe a moment when the world was still whole, when the pre-flood kings reigned with unimaginable longevity, and when the Anunna walked openly among humanity. But something changed. Something stirred in the heavens, something so immense and catastrophic that even the divine beings who shaped early civilization were shaken by what they foresaw. According to the tablets, the decision to bring the flood did not arise from a single cause. It was not punishment in the moral sense. Instead, it was tied to cosmic forces, to cycles beyond human understanding, to patterns the Anunna themselves could perceive but not fully control. The great god Enlil, often portrayed as a stern administrator of destiny, sensed an imbalance. Humanity had spread too widely, grown too noisy, too chaotic. The delicate harmony the Anunna had created between heaven and earth was shifting. Some texts even suggest that environmental forces, storms, tremors, shifts in the waters, were signs of an approaching catastrophe, not wholly divine in origin, but intensified by their own decisions. Whatever the cause, the tablets insist on one point. The flood was inevitable, but Enki, the Lord of Wisdom, fresh waters, and the deep, disagreed with the harshness of this destiny. In Sumerian tradition, Enki is not only clever, but deeply protective of human beings. He sees their potential, their fragility, their role in the cosmic order. So when the other Anunna agreed to withdraw guidance and let the world reset, Enki took a risk, a dangerous act of rebellion cloaked in subtlety. He did not openly defy the decree. That would have triggered divine conflict. Instead, he acted in a way the tablets describe with poetic brilliance. He spoke to the walls of Ziusudra's reed hut, technically fulfilling the law by not addressing a human directly. Through the thin barrier, Ziusudra heard his voice. "Demolish your house and build a boat," Enki said. "Abandon possessions. Save life." Ziusudra was not a king. He was a priest, a man of ritual purity, a scholar of the old ways. His role was to maintain harmony between the human world and the divine. And in that moment, Enki chose him as the bridge between the old era and the new. But unlike later versions of this story, like Noah, the Sumerian account is not moralistic. Ziusudra is not chosen because he is righteous. He is chosen because he can understand, because he listens. The tablets describe the construction of the vessel in careful detail. It was not a small craft or a simple barge. It was vast, reinforced with bitumen, structured in multiple levels, designed to survive unimaginable forces. The flood that approached was not a river overflow or a seasonal surge. It was a planetary event. When researchers in the modern era examined geological evidence for ancient cataclysms, they found something astonishing. Around 12,800 years ago, long before the official rise of Sumer, the Earth underwent a sudden and violent transformation known as the Younger Dryas Impact Event. The evidence suggests comet fragments or a major cosmic impact triggered colossal floods, atmospheric shock waves, and rapid climate collapse. Sea levels rose dramatically, Coastal regions, where early civilizations might have thrived, were swallowed whole. The Sumerians, writing thousands of years after this cataclysm, preserved a memory of it with uncanny detail. They described lightning storms, roaring waters, darkness at noon, and a deluge so intense that even the highest temples vanished beneath the waves. This was not a local flood. It was global devastation. Ziusudra launched his vessel into this chaos. For 7 days and 7 nights, according to the tablets, the storm raged. The world was reduced to one endless ocean. The Anunna themselves were terrified. The texts say they cowered like flies, horrified by the destruction they had unleashed. Even Enlil, the architect of the decree, felt remorse as he watched the annihilation of humanity. When the storm finally subsided, Ziusudra's boat came to rest at a place described as the Mountain of the Sunrise. Later traditions would interpret this as a distant peak, Ararat, or perhaps a mountain in the Zagros range. The Sumerian text is less literal and more symbolic, but what matters is what happened next. Ziusudra emerged into a silent world. The waters receded, the air stilled. There were no cities, no temples, no markets, no kings. Civilization had been erased. Before rebuilding could begin, something profound occurred. The Anunna returned. In the Epic of Gilgamesh and earlier Sumerian versions, the moment the gods appear is described with awe. They descend once more, but this time their presence carries sorrow and reverence. Enlil, moved by Ziusudra's endurance and Enki's defiance, grants the survivor and his family a unique fate, a form of immortality, a place among the divine realm, a role as keeper and transmitter of the old knowledge. This detail is critical. The Sumerians believed Ziusudra did not simply repopulate the earth. He preserved knowledge, sacred knowledge, scientific knowledge, cosmic knowledge. He carried the memory of a world that no longer existed. And from him, the post-flood civilizations inherited fragments of the ancient wisdom that preceded the cataclysm. The Sumerian King List echoes this transition. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven once again, this time to the city of Kish. The lifespans of kings shrink dramatically. Reigns become hundreds of years, then dozens. Something had changed in humanity or in the world itself. The Anunna were still present, but their interactions became less direct, less physical. They no longer ruled openly. They guided from the shadows through selected kings, priests, and sages. This shift marks the beginning of what we might call recorded history. But for the Sumerians, it was a continuation of something far older. They saw themselves not as pioneers, but as inheritors, recovering fragments of a lost age. The flood did not erase memory entirely. It reshaped it. It filtered it. It crystallized it into myth and ritual and carved it into clay. But here lies the deeper mystery. If the flood was real, and if the Sumerians preserved its memory accurately, what else did they inherit from that forgotten world? What knowledge survived the deluge? What scientific understanding carried through the shadows of time? The answer may lie in their astonishing grasp of the heavens, the stars, the planets, the cycles of the sky, knowledge that should have taken centuries to develop but appears fully formed in their earliest writings. It is here that we encounter one of the most debated aspects of Sumerian culture, their advanced astronomy. Because after the Great Flood, after kingship returned, after the world stabilized, the Sumerians began to map the heavens with a precision that defies everything we expect from an early civilization. Their mythology speaks of divine gifts. Their tablets speak of calculation. Their temples align with celestial markers, and their star charts contain details that modern scholars struggle to explain. If the flood marked the end of one world and the beginning of another, then astronomy became the Sumerians' bridge between past and future, a way to anchor themselves in cosmic order, to recover what had been lost, and to honor the beings who once walked among them. And so we turn now to the heavens themselves. to the Sumerian understanding of the cosmos, and to the extraordinary knowledge they claimed was given to them by the Anunna. What they recorded next will challenge everything we assume about ancient science and human origins. When the floodwaters receded and the world entered a new era, the Sumerians began rebuilding not only their cities, but their understanding of the cosmos. To them, the heavens were not distant or abstract. They were a living roadmap, a coded script left behind by the very beings who had shaped their civilization. And among all the knowledge the Anunna purportedly bestowed, none was treated with more reverence or guarded more carefully than astronomy. It is here that the Sumerian legacy becomes astonishingly clear and deeply unsettling. In the earliest tablets we possess, dating back more than 5,000 years, the Sumerians already display a mastery of the sky that seems almost out of place in its era. They did not grope their way toward astronomy through trial and error. They did not slowly refine their models of the heavens. Instead, they began with a system that was already deeply structured, meticulous, and mathematically advanced. Their universe was divided into 3 great celestial regions, each governed by a different deity. The paths of the stars were carefully mapped. The cycles of the moon were charted with near-perfect accuracy. Even the movements of the planets, objects that wander unpredictably against the backdrop of fixed stars, were tracked and named. This level of sophistication should have taken generations of dedicated observation, yet it appears fully formed from the earliest layers of Sumerian history. One of the most extraordinary aspects of Sumerian astronomy is their sexagesimal, or base 60, mathematical system. To the modern mind, base 60 feels alien, but it is remarkably efficient for dividing time and space. 60 can be split evenly by more factors than any number under 100, making it ideal for astronomy. The Sumerians used it to calculate angles, measure time, and structure calendars. The fact that we still divide circles into 360 degrees, hours into 60 minutes, and minutes into 60 seconds is a direct inheritance from their system. But the question is, why base 60? Why not 10 or 12 or another natural number? The choice seems arbitrary, unless it was not their invention at all. According to their own writings, this system was part of the the divine decrees the Anunna brought with them. The Sumerians did not claim to have created mathematics. They said they were taught. That claim becomes far more provocative when we consider the planets. In the tablets, the Sumerians describe celestial bodies that should have been invisible to the naked eye. They appear to have known of Uranus and Neptune, planets not officially discovered until the modern era. They refer to a total of 12 major celestial objects: the sun, the moon, the known planets, and an additional body whose identity remains hotly debated today. Some scholars argue these references are misinterpretations, symbolic rather than literal, but the descriptions are unusually technical. They discuss orbits, alignments, and celestial paths. They classify the planets into groups based on motion and positioning. They even place the sun at the center of what appears to be a conceptual model, a detail that contradicts the later geocentric worldview and would not be scientifically accepted until thousands of years later. How could they have known this? The most conventional answer is that they did not, that we are projecting modern ideas onto ancient texts. Yet the more one reads their astronomical tablets, the harder this explanation becomes to sustain. Their calculations for lunar eclipses are accurate. Their month-length adjustments show a profound grasp of the difference between solar and lunar cycles. Their star catalogs are consistent across centuries. Something, or someone, guided their early steps into the science of the sky. For the Sumerians, that someone was the Anunna. They believed these beings had mastery over the heavens and brought that knowledge to earth. Temples dedicated to them often doubled as observatories. Priests who served them were trained as astronomers, capable of predicting planetary movements, solstices, and eclipses. These were not vague spiritual rites. They involved precise measurement, calculation, and recording. One of the most intriguing examples is the Emul Apin, a series of tablets that list more than 70 stars and constellations, provide instructions for calculating the positions of the planets, and describe methods for predicting celestial events. The sheer complexity of Emul Apin has baffled scholars. It reads like the work of a civilization that had been studying the sky for thousands of years. Yet the Sumerians appeared on the historical stage suddenly, without a long period of development. It is here that the line between historical evolution and inherited knowledge begins to blur. The Sumerians themselves attributed their astronomy to the teachings of specific Anunna, Nana, the moon god, Utu, the sun god, Inanna, the goddess of Venus. These deities were not distant spirits. They were beings who, according to the texts, moved through the sky in luminous vessels, descending and ascending at will. In the modern mind, this sounds mythic, but to the Sumerians, this was simply observation filtered through their cultural lens. They described what they saw: movement, brilliance, descent. Whether these descriptions were literal, metaphorical, or distorted memories of something else, that is the question scholars still grapple with. What makes the mystery even deeper is that Sumerian astronomy seems to preserve knowledge that predates them, knowledge that may have originated in the pre-flood world. After all, the Sumerians claimed their earliest kings inherited wisdom from a time when divine beings walked openly among humanity. If the Anunna taught humans in that era, then the astronomical system the Sumerians used may have been a survival of something much older. Even ancient temples reflect this. Many early Sumerian ziggurats were aligned not with earthly landmarks, but with celestial ones. Their entire urban design often mirrored constellations or cosmic patterns. In this sense, Sumerian cities were not just settlements. They were cosmological diagrams, anchoring heaven to earth through sacred geometry. But perhaps the most provocative piece of Sumerian astronomy is their insistence that the heavens were not just distant objects, but a living system, one populated by realms, paths, and domains belonging to different Anunna. They believed the cosmos was full of life, intelligence, and movement. They believed humanity was not isolated, but connected to beings from beyond. Modern science may not share these conclusions, yet the precision of their observations cannot be dismissed. And when one compares Sumerian star lore to Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, and Mesoamerican traditions, striking parallels emerge. Ancient cultures, continents apart, all claiming to have received astronomical knowledge from divine or skyborn teachers. Where did this convergence come from? Coincidence? Parallel evolution? Or a shared memory of ancient contact? As we move forward in their story, the Sumerians begin to describe the physical spaces built to honor these skyborn beings: cities, temples, and sacred sites designed not just as places of worship, but as portals between realms, because to the Sumerians, their cities were not merely human creations. They were architectural echoes of the heavens, places where the Anunna descended, taught, ruled, and departed. And nowhere is this legacy clearer than in the sacred city temples that formed the backbone of their civilization. The next chapter leads us into those cities, into the ziggurats, the holy precincts, the gates of the gods, into the places where heaven and earth met, into the doorways of the divine. If the Sumerian understanding of the heavens reveals the scope of what they believed the Anunna taught them, then the cities they built show where those teachings were said to have unfolded. To the Sumerians, their cities were not simply human settlements. They were sacred constructs, living embodiments of cosmic order, mapped onto the earth at precise locations chosen by the divine. Each city was both a center of administration and a spiritual outpost, a bridge between the physical world and the celestial realm. And at the heart of each of these sacred cities stood the greatest architectural symbol of the Sumerian worldview, the ziggurat, a monumental, multi-layered stepped platform designed as a meeting point between gods and humans. In our modern gaze, ziggurats appear as towering pyramids of mud brick, impressive but ancient. But to the Sumerians, they were much more than architectural feats. They were functional portals, cosmic stairways, the highest points where the divine could descend and the human could ascend. They were designed with astronomical alignment, built on foundations that anchored them not only to the earth, but to the heavens. Yet before we examine these structures individually, we must understand the concept that bound them all together. The sacred cities of the Anunna. Each Sumerian city-state was dedicated to a particular divine being. This was not symbolic. This was jurisdictional. The Anunna did not rule from afar. They were said to inhabit these cities physically, to have their own houses, their own courts, their own rituals, and the human kings and priests served as intermediaries, managing earthly affairs under divine oversight. The first of these sacred sites, and perhaps the most important, was Eridu. To the Sumerians, Eridu was the original city, the first point of civilization, the place where the Anunna touched the earth. Modern excavations confirm something extraordinary. Eridu contains more than a dozen layers of temples, each one built on the ruins of the previous one, forming a vertical timeline of devotion spanning centuries. In their earliest myths, Eridu is described as the home of Enki, the god of wisdom and waters. His temple was called the Iabzu, the house of the deep waters. To the Sumerians, this was not only a place of ritual, it was the origin point of knowledge. They believed Enki emerged from the cosmic waters to establish Eridu as the center from which the the divine decrees, flowed into the world. From Eridu, the Anunna expanded their influence to Uruk, a city of staggering innovation. Uruk was not only a political powerhouse, but a cultural one. Here, writing flourished, bureaucracy expanded, architecture soared, and the concept of kingship became deeply established. Uruk's patron deity was Anunna, fierce, brilliant, associated with the planet Venus, and described as a being of immense power whose radiant descent was recorded in hymns across centuries. Her temple, the Anunna, was more than a sanctuary. Its ceremonial streets, its gateways, its towering structures reflected cosmic alignments tied to Venus. Anunna was said to travel between realms, ascending and descending through cycles mirrored in the sky. The rituals of Uruk reenacted these descents, symbolic reflections of celestial phenomena, physical movements echoing cosmic patterns. To the north stood Nippur, the spiritual heart of Sumer. Nippur did not rule politically, but spiritually it dominated. It was the city of Enlil, the High Lord of the Wind, the decreer of destinies, the architect of kingship. The Ikur, Enlil's temple, was described as the mountain house, a structure meant to resemble the cosmic mountain connecting heaven and earth. Even today, excavations reveal a grand complex once filled with scribes, priests, astronomers, and administrators. Nippur was where kings came to claim legitimacy. Without Enlil's blessing, a ruler's power was incomplete. This idea, that divine authority legitimizes earthly rule, began here and rippled through the ancient world, eventually resurfacing as the divine right of kings in later civilizations. Further south, rose as a city of power and wealth. Its ziggurat remains one of the best-preserved structures of the ancient world. To the Sumerians, was the home of Nanna, the moon god, a deity deeply tied to calendars, omens, and timekeeping. In priests spent nights atop the ziggurat, tracking the motion of the heavens. The moon was not merely a celestial body, it was a divine marker of cycles, fate, and cosmic rhythm. The ziggurat of was not a place of worship alone, it was an observatory. Its height and orientation allowed priests to follow the moon's path with precision, and because the moon governed agricultural cycles, festivals, labor, and navigation, the city thrived as a hub of commerce and ritual. Then there was Lagash, a city ruled by Ningirsu, a fierce warrior deity. Lagash became known for military might, for battles recorded in astonishing detail, and for one of the earliest known examples of social reform, the Code of Uruk-agina, which sought to restore justice by removing the corruption of officials and priests. Even this act was framed not as human righteousness, but as divine obligation. Kings ruled in the name of the gods. Their duty was not merely political, but cosmological. Finally, we arrive at Larsa, Sippar, Adab, and Kish, each carrying its own divine patron, its own temple orientations, and its own unique mythic functions. In sum, the Sumerian cities formed a network, a sacred grid across the land. Each city was a station of power, a node in a cosmic map whose logic only becomes clear when seen through the eyes of their creators. What makes this system so extraordinary is not simply the diversity of cities or the complexity of their design, but the underlying principle. Every city was founded with divine direct involvement. According to the Sumerians, the Anunna did not create civilization in one place and watch it spread. They established a network of sacred sites, each with its own purpose, its own influence, its own celestial alignment. This idea resurfaces across the ancient world. Egypt's pyramids align with Orion's belt. Teotihuacan echoes stellar patterns. Angkor Wat mirrors the constellations. Göbekli Tepe includes astronomical markers older than agriculture itself. Why did so many early civilizations care so deeply about aligning their structures with the heavens? What were they trying to mimic or honor? For the Sumerians, the answer was clear. The heavens were the home of the Anunna, and the cities below had to reflect the order above. The ziggurats were the literal meeting points. Their stepped design invited descent, a platform for the divine to approach the human realm, a bridge for communication, ritual, and cosmic synchronization. In many temple hymns, the Anunna are described as descending upon the shining stairways. They did not appear in dreams or visions. They arrived physically, in brilliance and radiance, greeted by priests and kings prepared for their coming. This idea, divine beings descending upon sacred structures, appears again and again across distant cultures, separated by oceans and millennia. Similar architectural sacred mountains appear in Mesoamerica, the Indus Valley, and early Chinese city-states. Is this convergence mere coincidence, or does it point to a shared, ancient memory? As we move deeper into the Sumerian world, we begin to see how these sacred cities formed the backbone of a civilization far ahead of its time. They were urban centers, yes, but also observatories, libraries, schools, administrative hubs, and ritual gates. They were a microcosm of the universe, a reflection of divine order imposed upon earthly chaos. But what kind of legacy did these cities leave behind? How did their structure, rituals, and knowledge shape the civilizations that followed? And more importantly, how did the Sumerians transform from a collection of sacred centers into the beating heart of human innovation? To understand this, we must follow their influence outward into the cultures, sciences, laws, and technologies that define civilization itself. Because what the Sumerians built in these cities did not stay in Sumer. It spread, it transformed, it seeded the world. And in the next chapter, we uncover how the legacy of the Sumerians shaped everything we know, from writing to kingdoms, from trade to religion, from science to myth. The story of humanity cannot be told without them, and their influence continues in ways we seldom recognize. The next block brings us into that legacy, the inheritance that survived time, conquest, and the shifting sands of history. Civilizations rise and fall, but their echoes remain, embedded in language, in symbols, in systems of thought we take for granted. And when we trace those echoes backward, past Rome and Greece, past Egypt and Babylon, past the earliest kingdoms of the Levant, we eventually reach a single source, a wellspring of ideas so vast and so foundational that it still shapes the structure of our world, Sumer. To understand the depth of this influence, we must step out of the sacred cities themselves and look at what the Sumerians left behind, not in physical ruins, but in intellectual architecture. When the Anunna established their cities, they gave the Sumerians more than astronomy and kingship. They gave them the framework of civilization itself, a blueprint that humanity would adapt, replicate, and refine for thousands of years. Consider writing. Before Sumer, communication was limited to oral tradition, gestures, symbols, etched sporadically onto pottery or bone. After Sumer, writing became a tool capable of storing human memory indefinitely. But the Sumerians did not treat writing as a human invention. They considered it a divine gift, one of the me, delivered from the realm of the gods to the hands of scribes. Cuneiform was their masterpiece. Those wedge-shaped impressions look primitive to us now, but they represented an astonishing leap forward. In Sumerian schools, adubas, students spent years mastering a curriculum that included copying myths, recording transactions, solving math problems, and even writing philosophical proverbs. The existence of schools alone represents a monumental shift. Knowledge was no longer transmitted through lineage alone. It became institutional, structured, and preserved. From writing came bureaucracy, and from bureaucracy came law. The Sumerians were the first to codify laws into official records, setting precedents for personal rights, property boundaries, contracts, wages, and civil responsibilities. Their legal framework influenced the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and ultimately the famous Code of Hammurabi, a document often cited as the earliest law code, though the Sumerians came long before it. Then there is mathematics. Everything in modern society, engineering, physics, economics, architecture, owes a debt to the Sumerian base 60 system. Their innovations in geometry allowed them to measure land, calculate areas, and map fields with precision. Their use of reciprocals made division easier. Their knowledge of Pythagorean triangles predated Pythagoras by more than 1,000 years. Even commerce carries their imprint. The Sumerians invented standardized weights and measures, contracts, receipts, and interest-based loans. They developed extensive trade networks connecting Mesopotamia to distant lands, Anatolia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and the Persian Gulf. Lapis lazuli, tin, obsidian, luxury textiles, oils, and grains moved through their markets. Their economy was not primitive. It was global, but perhaps the most powerful legacy they left was the city itself. Before Sumer, human settlements were scattered and small. After Sumer, the idea of the city became a cornerstone of civilization. Urban planning, zoning, public works, canals, marketplaces, administrative districts, all of these originated in Sumerian cities such as Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Nippur. Their irrigation networks remain one of the earliest and most impressive engineering feats in history. The Sumerians carved the land with great canals, reservoirs, and dams, turning arid plains into fertile farmland capable of supporting tens of thousands of people. This agricultural abundance fueled population growth, trade expansion, and political centralization. Yet the Sumerians attributed none of this to themselves. They believed that every innovation, every tool, every structure, every insight was part of the cosmic order bestowed by the Anunna. Their sacred texts describe me not just as decrees, but as elemental components of civilization: truth, kingship, justice, music, metallurgy, scribal knowledge, weaving, weaponry, architecture, navigation, and dozens more. When Anunna visits Eridu in one of their myths, she takes the me from Enki in a sequence that reads like an itemized list of human culture itself. Civilization was not a collection of skills developed independently. It was a package of divine principles transferred to humanity. This idea that humans were taught, not evolved, resonates across cultures. Ancient Egypt claimed Thoth gave them writing. The Greeks said Prometheus delivered fire and knowledge. The Maya credited Kukulkan with their calendars and agriculture. The Dogon of Mali speak of sky beings who taught them the structure of the cosmos. Different names, different languages. One recurring pattern, but Sumer holds the oldest version of the story. Their legacy is the earliest thread woven into a tapestry that spans continents. The influence did not stop with culture. It extended into myth. Many stories that later became foundational to other civilizations first appeared in Sumerian form. The Great Flood, the descent into the underworld, the creation of humanity from clay, the battle between sky beings, the cosmic mountain, the divine right of kings. All of these appear first in the tablets of Sumer. Even the idea of the soul, a luminous, eternal essence bound temporarily to a mortal body, is present in Sumerian belief. They called it the Z, a spark granted by the divine. It is a concept echoed in Egypt's Ka, India's Atman, and Greece's Psyche. How did cultures so distant develop such similar metaphysical ideas? What shared origin lay hidden beneath their mythic layers? When we examine the Sumerian worldview more closely, we see that they did not separate science from spirituality. Their temples doubled as observatories. Their rituals encoded astronomical cycles. Their myths concealed scientific principles. Their gods represented cosmic forces. Their priests were not only spiritual figures, but scientists, mathematicians, physicians, and engineers. This fusion shaped every civilization that followed. In Egypt, priests were astronomers. In Greece, philosophers studied geometry through divine symbolism. In India, temples aligned with stars. In China, the emperor's rule reflected the mandate of heaven. All of these traditions bear the fingerprints of a single source, a civilization that emerged suddenly, fully formed, as though awakening with memories not entirely its own. But this raises a troubling possibility. If humanity inherited knowledge from a previous era, perhaps from before the Great Flood, then how much have we forgotten? How many cycles of civilization preceded ours? How many resets have occurred? And if the Sumerians were correct that the Anunna guided their rise, what became of those beings? Did they withdraw? Did they leave? Do they still influence the world, but from a distance so subtle that we no longer recognize their presence? The legacy of Sumer forces us to confront these questions. Their contributions did not vanish. They were absorbed, transformed, carried forward by generations of cultures who never fully understood their origins. And now, as we return to the tablets themselves, we reach a point where the story turns inward, where we evaluate not only what Sumer gave to the world, but what the world chose to forget. Because while much of Sumerian knowledge was celebrated and adopted, there were aspects modern scholars prefer to ignore: the impossible reign lengths, the divine bloodlines, the celestial visitors, the creation of humanity through deliberate means. Why are these elements dismissed while their mathematics, laws, and architecture are accepted? What determines which parts of the ancient story survive and which are silenced? In the next block, we dive into that tension, the crossroads between accepted history and forbidden archaeology, because the tablets contain truths that challenge our assumptions, and the world has never been entirely comfortable with them. For more than a century, archaeologists, philologists, and historians have sifted through the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, piecing together the world of the Sumerians tablet by tablet, shard by shard. Their discoveries have transformed our understanding of humanity's earliest civilization, but they have also created a peculiar paradox. The very scholars who accept the brilliance of Sumerian achievements often reject the Sumerians' own explanations for how they achieved them. This tension between what the tablets say and what modern science is willing to entertain lies at the heart of the Sumerian mystery. On one hand, scholars praise the Sumerians for their innovations. They acknowledge the sudden emergence of writing, mathematics, astronomy, bureaucracy, medicine, agriculture, metallurgy, and city building. They call Uruk the world's first metropolis. They marvel at the engineering genius behind Sumerian irrigation systems. They accept the antiquity of the Sumerian King List as a historical document, at least for the periods after the flood. But on the other hand, they dismiss or minimize the elements that make Sumer truly extraordinary: the impossible lifespans, the skyborn gods, the sudden inception of civilization, the stories of creation through deliberate intervention, and the notion that humans were taught by beings of superior intellect. Why? Because these elements challenge the accepted timeline of human evolution. They suggest either a forgotten chapter of prehistory or a kind of contact modern science is not prepared to acknowledge. And so, academic narratives split Sumerian culture into two parts: the acceptable portion, writing, law, trade, agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, architecture; the unacceptable portion, the Anunna as real beings, kingship descending from heaven, reigns of tens of thousands of years, pre-flood civilizations, genetic manipulation in humanity's creation, advanced knowledge inherited rather than invented. The strange part is this: the tablets themselves make no such division. They present all these elements as parts of one coherent story. To the Sumerians, science and myth were not separate paths. They were threads of a single tapestry. Yet modern academia draws lines, creating boundaries that the Sumerians never recognized. Consider the creation of humanity. The Sumerians described humans as the result of deliberate intervention, a blending of divine essence with earthly material. They recorded it as a literal event, not a metaphor. And yet, any suggestion of genetic manipulation in antiquity is labeled pseudo-archaeology. Consider the pre-flood kings. The King List documents an entire era, thousands of years, that mainstream scholars refuse to take literally. And yet, geological evidence shows that a catastrophic flood event indeed occurred near the end of the last ice age. Consider the Anunna. The tablets describe them with physical detail: luminous skin, immense size, extraordinary longevity, powerful intellect. When scholars translate these stories, they routinely add the label mythological, even when the Sumerians themselves treated these events as historical. This selective acceptance reveals an intellectual bias, a filter imposed not by evidence, but by predetermined beliefs about what is possible. Yet despite these biases, cracks have begun to appear in the academic certainty. In recent decades, discoveries have forced scholars to reconsider humanity's past. Göbekli Tepe, a megalithic site older than Sumer, revealed architectural sophistication long before the agricultural revolution. Ancient DNA studies showed genetic complexity in human populations that cannot be easily explained by current migration models. Mysterious astronomical alignments in early sites across the world hint at a shared cosmic knowledge. These findings do not confirm the Sumerian stories, but they make them harder to dismiss outright. And so, we stand at a crossroads between two narratives: the traditional one, which claims civilization began slowly through incremental evolution with no external influence, and the Sumerian one, which claims civilization was sparked by contact with beings who possessed advanced knowledge. Both narratives cannot be true in their entirety. Yet one is carved in clay by the people who lived it, while the other is a modern reconstruction built on assumptions about what the past should have looked like. When modern scholars reject parts of the Sumerian story, they often justify it by saying ancient people used myth to explain the unknown. Yet the Sumerians were not a naive culture. They were methodical, meticulous, pragmatic. Their tablets are filled with accounting lists, legal contracts, astronomical data, agricultural records. They did not embellish these documents. They recorded facts. So why assume that the parts of their history involving the Anunna or pre-flood kings were exaggerations? What if those stories were based on memories, distorted by time, yes, but rooted in real events? What if the impossible reign lengths reflect a biological reality no longer present in humans? What if kingship descending from heaven describes an actual arrival of beings who imposed order? What if the advanced knowledge of the Sumerians was not discovered, but inherited? Modern science prefers simpler explanations, but simplicity is not truth. Truth is what remains when evidence refuses to be ignored. As more tablets are translated, a pattern emerges, one that cannot be easily explained as metaphor. The Sumerians believed they lived in a world shaped by beings who came from the sky, beings who taught, governed, created, and sometimes destroyed. And while scholars often avoid those parts of the story, the tablets themselves contain no hesitation. Yet this leads us to an even deeper question, one that modern science often fears to ask. If the Sumerians believed they were shaped by the Anunna, then what did they believe humanity was? Were humans simply animals lifted into awareness, servants crafted for labor, chosen partners of divine beings, accidents of genetic experimentation, or vessels carrying the spark of something eternal? The next block takes us into the most controversial chapter of the Sumerian legacy, the creation of humanity itself, not as a myth, but as a deliberate act. Because according to the tablets, we were made with intention, and the story of that creation is unlike anything taught in our modern world. To understand how the Sumerians viewed the creation of humanity, we must leave behind the comforts of modern assumptions and step into a worldview where the line between divine and mortal is not a wall, but a doorway. In their eyes, humanity did not simply emerge from the slow grind of evolution, nor were they shaped by chance. The Sumerians believed with unwavering certainty that humans were crafted deliberately, precisely, purposefully, and the architect of this creation was Enki. He was the god of wisdom, the keeper of the deep waters, the master of knowledge and craft. Where Enlil governed destiny and order, Enki governed life itself, its hidden structure, its potential, its spark. He was not a warrior or a king. He was a scientist, an engineer, an artisan of the biological world. In the Sumerian tablets, Enki is portrayed with a mind unlike any other. He understands the essence of things. He manipulates materials. He creates and recombines. He advises and warns, and he is deeply fascinated by humanity, its fragility, its capacity to grow, its potential to carry divine purpose. The story of human creation begins not with clay alone, but with a crisis. According to the tablets, the Anunna faced a problem. The labor of building cities, canals, temples, and irrigation systems was exhausting. The younger gods, known as the Igigi in some texts, rebelled. They refused to continue their endless toil. They complained of heavy burdens, of endless digging, of labor without rest. Tension grew in the divine council. A solution was needed. It was then that Enki proposed an idea that would forever alter Earth's destiny. "Let us create workers," he said, "beings who will bear the workload." But this was no simple task. Creating intelligent beings required a blending of essences, a combination of earthly material and divine substance. The tablets describe this process in language both poetic and strangely technical. They speak of mixing clay with the blood of a god, of shaping forms in the womb of creation, of using the essence that binds and the spirit that gives consciousness. One of the tablets, often called the Enki and Ninma text, describes a chamber filled with implements, jars, mixing bowls, and vessels. The imagery is unmistakable: a laboratory, a workshop, a place where biological manipulation was taking place. Enki and the goddess Ninma worked together, combining elements, adjusting forms, correcting flaws. Their goal was to create a being strong enough to work, intelligent enough to follow instructions, but not so powerful that they would rival the gods. This is where the story becomes even more astonishing. The Sumerians claimed that humans were not merely shaped from clay, they were infused with divine essence. The phrase used is zai, meaning life breath or spirit, and this essence came from a sacrificial god, a being whose blood was mixed with the clay. In this way, humanity became a hybrid of heaven and earth. The implications of this story ripple across ancient mythologies. In the Hebrew tradition, Adam is shaped from dust, infused with divine breath. In Egypt, Khnum forms humans on a potter's wheel. In Greece, Prometheus molds mankind from clay. In the Maya tradition, humans are formed from corn, mixed with divine elements. Across cultures, the idea of humans as cosmic hybrids persists, a combination of earth and something greater. The Sumerians, however, were specific. The essence used in the creation of humans did not come from a distant, unknowable god. It came from the bloodline of the Anunna themselves. This explains why their earliest kings were depicted as semi-divine. They were closer to the original genetic mixture. Their longevity was not symbolic. It was a vestige of their ancestry. When modern scholars read these tablets, they often insist the creation story is metaphorical. But the Sumerians recorded it with clinical detail. They described trial and error, early prototypes that could not stand, or could not speak, or could not reproduce. They describe corrections, adjustments, recalibrations. This is not mythic language. It is procedural. And here the story takes a dramatic turn. Once the human prototypes were perfected, the Anunna gave them a gift that would define their entire existence: purpose. Humans were created to work, but also to serve as intermediaries, beings capable of honoring the gods, preserving knowledge, performing rituals, and maintaining the cosmic balance. But as generations passed, humans grew in number. They formed communities. They acquired knowledge. Some granted, some discovered, some perhaps remembered. And in time, they became more than what the Anunna originally intended. This shift is evident in Sumerian mythology. Humans begin as servants, but evolve into partners. Kings serve as intermediaries, but also as rulers in their own right. Priests maintain the me, but also interpret the divine will. This evolution was not always peaceful. Some tablets hint at tension, at moments when humanity's growth or independence threatened the established order. In certain myths, Enlil is angered by human noise, by their expansion, by their ambition. In others, Enki protects humanity, arguing that their existence enriches the world. This dynamic between divine oversight and human autonomy parallels later religious traditions. The Bible's story of the Nephilim, for instance, suggests interactions between divine beings and humans. Greek myths describe gods intermingling with mortals. Even Hindu myths speak of divine incarnations and hybrid heroes. But Sumer is where the idea originates, the notion that humans were crafted with a dual nature, shaped from physical material, but carrying a spark of the divine. What does this dual nature imply? It suggests that humanity is not merely biological, it is spiritual, cosmic, intentional. It suggests that we are more than descendants of primates. We are beings with a lineage that touches realms beyond Earth. From this perspective, the Sumerians did not see themselves as primitive. They saw themselves as the continuation of a divine project. They were caretakers of knowledge. They were participants in a cosmic story. And this brings us to an even more controversial idea: the assertion that the Anunna did not merely create humanity, they continued to interact with us, guide us, teach us, and shape our destiny. This guidance manifested not only in creation myths, but in agriculture, astronomy, law, medicine, and kingship. The Sumerians believed they were living alongside their creators, and when the flood came, that bond was tested, but not severed. In the next block, we explore the nature of this interaction, the long period during which humans and the Anunna coexisted, a time described in the tablets with startling clarity, a time when gods walked in cities, kings spoke with them face to face, and knowledge flowed freely between realms. A time modern history refuses to acknowledge, but the Sumerians remembered vividly. When we imagine ancient gods, we often picture distant ethereal figures, beings who remain forever unseen, whose presence is felt only through symbols, rituals, or natural forces. But this is not how the Sumerians understood the Anunna. For them, the gods were not abstractions. They were present, visible, tangible. They walked in the streets of cities. They sat upon thrones. They held councils. They issued commands. And in the earliest age, the age before and shortly after the flood, they interacted with humanity directly, without the barriers that later mythologies would impose. This period of coexistence sits at the core of the Sumerian worldview. To them, human history was never a story of separation from the divine. It was a story of proximity, sometimes harmonious, sometimes fraught, but always intertwined. And the closer we examine their tablets, the more apparent this becomes. The Sumerians did not use vague language when describing the Anunna. They gave them bodies, attributes, temperaments, genealogies. They assigned them specific roles within a structured, almost bureaucratic hierarchy. They described their movements between cities, their rivalries, their alliances, their celebrations, even their moments of vulnerability. To the Sumerians, the divine realm and the human realm were not separated by infinite distance. They were connected through sacred places, sacred rituals, and sacred bloodlines. One of the clearest examples of this coexistence appears in the concept of kingship. In the earliest eras, kings were not simply political leaders. They were mediators, individuals who could stand in the presence of the Anunna. The King List emphasizes repeatedly, kingship descended from heaven. This was not a metaphor, it was a literal description of how authority was transferred. If the Anunna instructed humanity after the flood, it was through kings. Through them, divine order was enacted in the physical world. The earliest kings were often described as shepherds chosen by the gods. Shepherd, a humble, earthy word, yet imbued with cosmic significance. It suggested guidance, protection, responsibility, and duty under divine mandate. And so cities became stages upon which divine and human actors moved in synchrony. In Eridu, Enki presided over the deep waters and the mysteries of life. Myths describe people entering his temple and seeing him face to face, receiving instructions, blessings, or warnings. Enki's presence was not symbolic. It was a physical reality within the Sumerian mind. In Uruk, Inanna walked the streets during festivals. Hymns describe her radiant descent, a being of overwhelming power whose beauty dazzled mortal eyes. She was depicted as bold, fierce, inquisitive. She did not remain aloof. She engaged with humans, granting favor or unleashing wrath depending on circumstance. In Nippur, Enlil ruled as the divine administrator. He was distant in temperament but not invisible. Kings journeyed to his temple not to pray abstractly, but to enter his presence. A state described as awe-inspiring and overwhelming, as though stepping into a chamber charged with raw cosmic force. In Nana's light governed the cycles of human life. Priests recorded his appearances, his phases, his omens. They believed he communicated through celestial movement, yet their texts speak of him in personal terms, as a father, a protector, a lord who listened. These descriptions challenge our modern distinctions between myth and reality. They are too detailed, too consistent, too vividly portrayed to be mere allegory. The Sumerians truly believed they lived among divine beings. But how long did this coexistence last? The tablets offer hints but no precise timeline. They suggest that the earliest era, the age of massive rain lengths, was a time of direct contact. After the flood, the contact continues, but gradually shifts. The Anunna withdraw slightly, moving into more formal roles. Their appearances become tied to ritual cycles, to temple ceremonies, to sacred festivals. They remain present, but less constantly so. Why this change? Some texts imply that humanity grew too numerous, too ambitious, too noisy. Others suggest the world itself changed. Environmental shifts after the flood created a barrier between realms. Still others hint at internal conflicts among the Anunna that made their presence less stable. Whatever the reason, the human-divine relationship became more codified, structured, and ritualized. Temples became the main points of interaction, houses built not only for worship, but for literal visitation. Priests became translators, interpreters of divine will. Kings became representatives, bearing both human burdens and divine expectations. Yet even as the Anunna withdrew from open daily life, they continued to influence human destiny through dreams, omens, counsels, and decrees. One of the most revealing tablets, known as the Lamentations, describes a moment when the gods temporarily abandoned a city. The people respond with anguish, not because their faith is shaken, but because the physical presence of the gods is gone. To the Sumerians, divine absence was not spiritual. It was literal, a loss of protection, guidance, and order. This coexistence, physical or near-physical, persisted for centuries. But as time passed, the relationship changed further. The Anunna became increasingly distant, their interactions with humanity less direct, more symbolic. Their teachings remained, but their presence faded from view. This raises a profound question. Were the Sumerians describing beings who were eventually forced to leave, or beings who chose to withdraw, or beings whose presence could no longer be perceived by a changing humanity? Every ancient civilization holds traces of a similar story. Divine beings withdrawing from the world, leaving behind rituals, laws, and knowledge to guide humanity in their absence. In Greece, the gods become remote after the age of heroes. In Egypt, the gods depart and appoint pharaohs as intermediaries. In India, divine incarnations become rarer as the ages progress. In Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent departs across the sea, promising to return. Different names, different cultures, a shared narrative thread. The Sumerians, however, recorded the earliest version of this story, the moment when the divine stepped back and human beings were left to rise, stumble, rebuild, and continue on their own. Yet even as the Anunna withdrew, their legacy remained, in the form of law, in the structure of cities, in the knowledge of the stars, in the rituals of kingship, in the very shape of human consciousness. And this brings us to the final movement of their story, not the ancient past, but the long shadow it casts across history. Because the Sumerians believed humanity was not abandoned. They believed humanity was entrusted with knowledge, entrusted with civilization, entrusted with memory, and entrusted, most of all, with a question that echoes across time. What are we now that the gods have stepped away? The next block explores this legacy, the enduring imprint of the Anunna on human evolution, religion, science, and identity. A legacy not erased by time, but hidden in plain sight. When the presence of the Anunna began to fade from daily life, the Sumerians did not interpret this as abandonment. Instead, they believed humanity had entered a new phase, an age in which humans were expected to carry the torch of knowledge on their own. The gods had once walked among them, shaped them, taught them, and governed them. Now their teachings remained, but their footsteps grew distant. This transition, from divine proximity to human responsibility, is one of the most profound themes in Sumerian thought, and it is a theme that reappears across nearly every civilization that followed. But before we explore how this legacy spread into the wider world, we must examine what the Sumerians believed the Anunna left behind, because they did not leave empty-handed. They left a blueprint for order, for life, for civilization itself. The me. These were not mere commandments or virtues. They were cosmic instructions, the operating system of the universe. Each me represented a domain of existence: kingship, truth, art, music, crafts, warfare, judgment, fertility, mathematics, writing, rituals, architecture, navigation, even emotions and social roles. To the Sumerians, the me were the fundamental building blocks of reality. Without them, nothing could function. With them, the world held order. They were housed originally in Eridu, under Enki's care. When Inanna visited Eridu and took the me to her city of Uruk, an event described with a sense of dramatic tension, She did not steal power. She redistributed civilization. The diffusion of divine knowledge was necessary for humanity to flourish across lands and generations. This transfer is one of the clearest metaphorical reflections of the shift from divine rule to human stewardship. It was not only the me that the Anunna bestowed, but entire systems. Writing became the guardian of memory. Law became the guardian of justice. Astronomy became the guardian of time. Mathematics became the guardian of structure. Kingship became the guardian of society. Ritual became the guardian of divine presence. Together, these created a civilization capable of thriving long after the gods themselves faded from sight. Yet even as humanity took on this responsibility, the Sumerians believed the divine presence continued in more subtle forms. They saw omens in the sky, eclipses, planetary movements, the appearance of comets. They saw divine will in natural cycles, floods, storms, harvests, droughts. They saw the gods in dreams, in visions, in the soft boundary between sleep and waking. They believed the divine still influenced kings, still whispered to priests, still guided destiny, but from a distance. This shift is mirrored in their later myths. The gods become more bureaucratic, more ritualistic, more remote. They hold councils in heaven. They send messengers instead of arriving in person. They communicate through signs rather than physical appearance. The more humanity evolves, the more the gods retreat into the background. This pattern, gods present at the dawn of civilization, gradually withdrawing as humans grow, becomes a template repeated across the ancient world. In Egypt, the earliest kings were called sons of Ra, ruling side by side with divine beings, but over time the gods withdrew into temples and statues. In Greece, the Golden Age is remembered as a time when gods and humans mingled freely, followed by Silver and Bronze Ages where divine presence diminishes. In India, divine avatars appear in earlier yugas but become rare in later ones. In Mesoamerica, the god-king Quetzalcoatl departs across the ocean, promising to return only when humanity is ready. These parallels are too striking to ignore. They suggest not only shared mythic patterns, but perhaps a shared memory, a collective echo of a time when the line between gods and humans was thinner. Nowhere is this more clearly preserved than in Sumer. Even after the Anunna withdrew from daily life, their fingerprints remained on every structure of society. To understand the depth of their influence, we must examine 5 domains where the Sumerian legacy shaped the entire course of human history. 1. Kingship and governance. The idea that rulers derive authority from a higher realm begins in Sumer. The king is not simply elected or born, he is chosen. This concept spreads to Akkad, then to Babylon, then to Assyria, and much later to Egypt, Persia, and Rome. It eventually becomes the medieval European doctrine of divine right. 2. Writing and record-keeping. The Sumerians' invention of cuneiform transforms humanity. Writing becomes the tool that allows civilizations to grow beyond oral memory. Law codes, economic records, rituals, astronomical charts, all preserved because of cuneiform. Without writing, history as we know it does not exist. 3. Time and astronomy. Sumerian astronomy becomes the backbone of calendars across the ancient world. The sexagesimal system becomes embedded in geometry, navigation, and timekeeping. Even today, we count seconds and degrees according to their system. 4. Religion and mythology. Most ancient mythic structures, divine councils, sky gods, underworlds, flood myths, creation from clay, heavenly descent, originate in Sumerian thought. These ideas ripple outward into Akkadian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Egyptian, Greek, Persian, and even early Christian frameworks. 5. Architecture and urban design. The first cities, with districts, zoning, markets, temples, and fortifications, originate in Sumer. Their architectural influence echoes through Babylon, Nineveh, Thebes, Persepolis, and beyond. Yet for all their contributions, the Sumerians held a belief that modern scholars find unsettling, that humanity's power and knowledge did not arise from within, but from above. This belief is not a footnote. It is the backbone of their worldview. And this is where Sumerian influence encounters resistance in modern academia. Archaeologists embrace their achievements but avoid their explanations. Historians praise their systems but reject their origins. Scientists admire their calculations but ignore their claims of divine teachers. The narrative is accepted, but the context is stripped away. Why? Because accepting the Sumerians' accounts at face value forces us to reconsider human origins. It suggests we are not alone, that Earth's past may include contact with advanced beings, that the flood was not just a myth, but a memory, that humanity's sudden leap into civilization was not an accident. These possibilities challenge the boundaries of anthropology, history, theology, and science. But the tablets remain, carved in clay, unapologetic, certain. If the Sumerians inherited knowledge from beings who once roamed the earth, then their legacy is not simply historical, it is cosmic. And this leads us directly into the next chapter, the mystery of why the Anunna withdrew, what became of them, and whether traces of their presence still linger in the myths, religions, and unexplained phenomena of the ancient world. Because the Sumerians did not believe the gods vanished forever. They believed the gods retreated and promised to return. If the Sumerians believed the Anunna withdrew rather than disappeared, then the natural question becomes, where did they go? Their tablets do not offer a single conclusive answer. Instead, they provide fragments, scattered references, hymns, ritual descriptions, astronomical metaphors, and mythic narratives that hint at a departure both physical and cosmic. To the Sumerians, the withdrawal of the Anunna was not an ending, but a transition, a shift in realms, a retreat behind a veil that only the initiated could perceive. And so we must gather these fragments, piece by piece, to understand what the Sumerians truly believed became of the beings who shaped them. The first clue lies in the concept of the Duku, the holy mound. This was described not as a place on earth, but as a radiant realm above the mortal world, a place where decrees were issued, destinies woven, and divine assemblies held. It is from the Duku, the texts say, that the Anunna descended in the earliest age, and it is to the Duku they returned when their work on earth was complete. But the Duku is not heaven in the religious sense we use today. It is described with startling physicality, a place of brightness, of brilliance, of movement, of architecture, a place where the divine dwell in structures not unlike the great temples below. Some hymns describe pathways stretching between the stars. Others speak of the great gates of the sky through which the Anunna traveled. These descriptions are vague enough to be poetic, yet concrete enough to raise an eyebrow. If the Anunna withdrew to the Duku, then the Sumerians believed they withdrew skyward. The second clue appears in a series of tablets describing the boats of heaven, vessels used by gods like Inanna, Utu, and Nana. These were not metaphorical chariots. The texts describe them docking on ziggurats, resting in sacred precincts, lifting and descending with radiant light. Priests performed rituals to clear the pathways before these vessels arrived. Temples had dedicated platforms called Duku Nu, landing areas. To the Sumerians, the sky was not an unreachable expanse. It was a highway. The third clue lies in the cycles of absence and return. Many Anunna were described as leaving for extended periods, only to return during specific celestial alignments. Inanna descended to Earth on a timed cycle matching the movements of Venus. Utu rose and vanished according to solar patterns. Nana followed the moon. These cycles were not symbolic. They were calendars of divine visitation. The Sumerians believed the movements of the gods in the heavens mirrored their movements on Earth. When a planet disappeared behind the sun, the deity associated with that planet was believed to be traveling, convening with other gods, or entering the hidden realm. When the planet reappeared, the the god was said to have returned. This blending of astronomy and divinity suggests something profound. The Sumerians mapped divine activity onto celestial mechanics because they saw the two as inseparable. The fourth clue comes from the narratives of ascension. Several Anunna are said to have risen to the heavens after the flood era, not dying, not vanishing, but leaving deliberately. Enlil returns to the upper realm. Enki divides his time between the deep and the sky. Inanna ascends after her descent to the underworld, radiating power. Utu travels the road of the sky, governing justice and truth from above. These are not metaphors for death. They are transitions, movements between realms of existence. But the fifth clue is the most intriguing, the promise of return. In multiple tablets, the Anunna speak of cycles, eras of closeness, eras of distance, and eras still yet to come. They describe times when humanity will stand alone, learning to govern itself. They describe times when the veil between realms will thin, when knowledge will once again flow from above. The Sumerians believed history was cyclical, not linear. They believed the divine would return when the chords of destiny aligned. This idea echoes globally. The Egyptians awaited the return of Osiris. The Maya awaited the return of Kukulkan. The Hopi await the return of the blue star Kachina. The Hindus expect the final avatar of Vishnu. The Christians await the second coming. The Muslims await the descent of Isa. The Zoroastrians await the Saoshyant. Different cultures, different names. One archetype, the return of a cosmic being when humanity enters a new age. This motif, so widespread, so consistent, may have originated in Sumer, the earliest civilization to record such expectations. But why did the Anunna leave in the first place? The tablets offer several possibilities. 1. Humanity no longer needed direct guidance. Once writing, law, agriculture, astronomy, and kingship were established, humans could sustain civilization themselves. 2. The world changed after the flood. Environmental or cosmic shifts may have altered the conditions that once allowed the Anunna to remain physically present. 3. Conflicts among the Anunna forced a retreat. Some myths depict internal disputes, wars of succession, disagreements about humanity's role. 4. The Anunna completed their mission. They came to establish order and left once the foundation was secure. 5. Humanity became too independent. Some interpretations suggest humans advanced or reproduced too quickly, creating tension. 6. They withdrew to prevent dependency. A recurring theme is that humans needed to grow on their own for the next phase of development. But the most provocative possibility is this. 7. The Anunna did not leave entirely. Their presence simply changed. The Sumerians believed the divine realm operates on frequencies, realms, and veils. Humans, bound by physical senses, cannot perceive certain forms of existence. If the Anunna shifted into a higher state, or a parallel domain, they may still be present, but no longer visible. In temple inscriptions, priests wrote of sensing the gods without seeing them. In astronomical texts, they recorded messages encoded in planetary alignment. In dream rituals, they described direct communication with divine beings. In myths, they spoke of times when the gods walked unseen. To the Sumerians, withdrawal did not equal absence. They believed the Anunna stepped behind a curtain of reality, a realm they called the Kur, or in later Akkadian, Irkala, an overlapping dimension. This idea appears again in Egyptian Duat, Greek Hades, Norse Asgard, and the Tibetan Bardo, realms adjoining ours, accessible only through specific conditions. The possibility is unsettling. What if the Anunna did not vanish into myth, but into a different layer of the world? And what if their return, prophesied in Sumerian hymns, is not poetic, but literal? If we accept the Sumerian worldview at face value, then humanity's oldest memory is of coexistence with beings from another realm. and humanity's oldest expectation is that they will return when the cycle turns. In the next block, we explore a concept that binds these ideas together, the possibility that the Anunna left traces not only in texts, but in genetic memory, in architecture, in global myth, and even in unexplained anomalies of the ancient world. Because if the Sumerians were the first civilization, and if they were shaped by beings from beyond, then the fingerprints of the Anunna should not appear only in clay tablets. They should appear everywhere. If the Anunna shaped the first civilization, and if their withdrawal was a transition rather than an end, then the echoes of their presence should not reside solely in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia. Their influence should ripple outward, across continents, across eras, across mythologies, even across the architecture and genetic memory of peoples who never knew the name Sumer. And that is precisely what we find when we examine the ancient world through the lens of continuity rather than coincidence. Everywhere we look, from the Nile to the Indus, from the high plains of the Andes to the river valleys of China, we uncover stories, symbols, and structures that reflect an origin far older and far more unified than traditional archaeology admits. These are not random parallels. They form a pattern that suggests the human story was shaped by a single mysterious influence in the deep past, an influence the Sumerians openly attributed to the Anunna. So let us begin tracking those fingerprints. The first and most obvious trace appears in architecture. Across the ancient world, civilizations separated by oceans built monumental structures aligned with the heavens. The pyramids of Egypt mirror Orion. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia align with solstices and equinoxes. Stonehenge tracks lunar cycles with surprising accuracy. The temples of Angkor mirror Draco. The pyramids of Teotihuacan align with the Pleiades and Venus. The Nazca lines point to constellations, and Göbekli Tepe, older than farming itself, contains astronomical markers carved into megaliths long before the rise of any known civilization. How did cultures so distant, with no known communication, create architecture that obeys the same cosmic patterns? Mainstream explanations rely on vague notions of primitive astronomy or universal skywatching, but the Sumerians provide a different answer. Because the first teachers of humanity were celestial beings who taught the same cosmic principles to cultures around the world. These principles became the blueprint of sacred architecture. The second trace appears in mythology. Nearly every ancient culture preserves a memory of divine beings who came from the sky, taught humanity, lived among them for a time, and eventually withdrew. The Egyptians spoke of the Neteru, skyborn beings who ruled in the first time. The Greeks remembered the Titans and Olympians, immortal beings who shaped early humanity. The Maya revered Kukulkan, a feathered serpent who descended from the heavens bringing knowledge. The Dogon of Mali claim beings from Sirius, taught them astronomy impossible to observe with the naked eye. The Chinese speak of the sons of heaven, rulers descended from celestial ancestors. The Polynesians remember beings who arrived from the sky in shining canoes. Indigenous tribes of the Americas recount sky beings who brought agriculture and order, different continents, different languages, the same foundational story. This cross-cultural consistency cannot be explained by trade or migration alone. It suggests a shared ancient memory, a memory the Sumerians wrote in explicit detail. The third trace of the Anunna appears in genetics. Modern genetic research reveals something both puzzling and profound. Humanity experienced sudden, rapid expansions of cognitive ability around the same time frame that the Sumerians said the gods created humans. The so-called Great Leap Forward, the unexpected emergence of symbolic thought, language, art, and complex tools, remains one of the great enigmas of anthropology. It is as though a switch was flipped, a sudden neurological upgrade, no slow gradient, no transitional fossils showing incremental development of advanced cognition, just a leap. The Sumerian explanation: humanity was intentionally shaped, engineered by the divine. Geneticists speak of bottlenecks, selection events, and rapid expansions. The Sumerians used different language, but described the same phenomenon: the mixing of divine essence with earthly matter to create a new species capable of building civilization. The fourth trace appears in symbols, the visual language shared by ancient cultures. The winged disk of Mesopotamia appears in Egypt, Persia, and Mesoamerica. The serpent deity appears worldwide, from Enki's serpentine symbolism to Quetzalcoatl, from the Chinese dragon to the Indian Naga. The tree of life appears in Sumer, Egypt, Scandinavia, and the Americas. Even the motif of the divine tablet, the Mi, appears as the Book of Thoth, the records of the Maya, the Akashic records in Hinduism. Different cultures, same symbols, same origins. The fifth trace lies in astronomical knowledge. Cultures globally possessed advanced star lore long before telescopes. They knew the precession of the equinoxes. They knew the alignment of stars in distant ages. The Maya calculated the synodic cycle of Venus with astonishing accuracy. The Egyptians knew Sirius's heliacal rising triggered the Nile flood. The Sumerians understood the movements of planets invisible to the naked eye. How? Because according to the earliest civilization on record, this knowledge was taught. The sixth trace appears in global flood myths. This one is unavoidable. Nearly every culture, in over 200 worldwide, recalls a catastrophic ancient deluge that wiped out a previous age. The Sumerians recorded it first, naming Ziusudra as the survivor. Later cultures retained the story, renaming him Utnapishtim, Atrahasis, Noah, Nu'u, Manu, Deucalion. These parallels are so precise, the warning, the vessel, the destruction, the renewal, that scholars struggle to claim coincidence. If a real global cataclysm occurred at the end of the last ice age, then it would have erased evidence of earlier civilizations. The Sumerians insisted such civilizations existed, and that the Anunna guided their reconstruction afterward. The seventh trace surfaces in linguistic structure. The earliest known languages with complex grammar, Sumerian, Egyptian, Sanskrit, appear suddenly. They do not evolve from simpler forms. They arrive fully functional. Sumerian is especially anomalous. It has no known linguistic relatives. It appears from nowhere, then disappears. That is not typical linguistic evolution, unless its origins are not human. The eighth trace lies in knowledge that appears too early. Metallurgy appears suddenly in the ancient world. So do advanced agricultural practices. So do irrigation networks. So does standardized measurement. These should have evolved slowly, yet they appear fully formed. The Sumerians claimed the Anunna taught these skills. The ninth trace appears in monumental engineering. Sites like Baalbek, Sacsayhuaman, and the pyramids contain stonework so advanced that modern engineers struggle to replicate it. Joints so precise, modern lasers cannot slip between them. Blocks weighing hundreds of tons moved without cranes. Alignments so accurate only astronomical software can explain them. Modern scholars shrug and say ingenuity. The Sumerians said divine instruction. The 10th trace appears in the human psyche. The idea that humanity once lived closer to the divine and longs to return is universal. A sense of separation, a memory of something lost, a feeling of exile. This psychological pattern appears in every culture, every religion, every myth. Could it be the echo of a real event? The withdrawal of beings who once walked among us? As we gather these traces, the picture becomes clearer. The Sumerian story is not an isolated myth. It is a foundational memory, the first written record of a pattern that repeats across the ancient world. But there is one more domain where their influence remains strongest, a domain we have not yet explored deeply: spirituality and the human quest for meaning. Because if the Anunna shaped humanity, and if humanity carries their essence, then spiritual longing, moral instinct, and the search for transcendence may not be cultural products. defaults. They may be inherited traits, echoes of our creators. In the next block, we explore this final, profound legacy, how the Sumerian worldview shaped humanity's concept of the soul, destiny, morality, and the cosmic journey of life itself. The story is no longer just about where we came from. It becomes a story about who we are and who we are meant to become. If the Sumerians inherited knowledge, order, and civilization from the Anunna, then the most profound inheritance of all was not writing, or astronomy, or law, but identity. The Sumerians were the first to ask the questions that have guided humanity for millennia. Who are we? Where did we come from? What is the soul? What happens after death? What is our purpose? And according to their tablets, the answers came not from human speculation, but from teachings passed down by the very beings who shaped humanity's origins. These teachings form the earliest recorded philosophy of the human soul, a framework so ancient, so foundational, that echoes of it still pulse through modern religion, spirituality, and metaphysics. At the center of this worldview lies a single idea. The human being is a hybrid creature, part earthly body, part divine essence. The Sumerians used two words to describe this dual nature: the sag, the physical form, and the zai, the animating spark, the life essence, the consciousness. The Z was not just breath. It was the divine inheritance, the fragment of cosmic intelligence the Anunna used to bring clay to life. This concept appears again in Egyptian Ka, Hebrew Ruach, Greek Psyche, Hindu Atman. But Sumerian texts are the earliest to articulate this idea in writing. To them, the soul did not originate in the body. It was installed, placed intentionally into human beings by their creators. And because this essence came from the Anunna, humans possessed not only the capacity to think, speak, work, and build, but the capacity to dream, question, imagine, and evolve. The divine spark is what made humans more than laborers. It gave them purpose. The Sumerians believed the soul had three fundamental qualities. 1. Consciousness, awareness of self and the world. 2. Memory, the ability to carry knowledge across lifetimes and eras. 3. Destiny, a path woven by cosmic forces but not entirely fixed. The Z was eternal. It did not end when the body died. Instead, it passed into the realm known as Kur, not a place of punishment, but a shadowy reflection of earthly life. There, the soul waited, remembered, and eventually returned to the world of the living. This is one of the most startling aspects of Sumerian belief. The notion of rebirth appears thousands of years before it emerges in Indian or Greek philosophy. The cycle of life, death, and return formed part of the cosmic order. Souls were not trapped. They were educated. Each life was a lesson. Each era was an opportunity. The Anunna taught humans to seek balance, wisdom, and alignment with the me, the divine principles of reality. To the Sumerians, spiritual evolution was not mystical. It was practical. It was part of the design. And this raises a profound question. If humans inherited divine essence, what did the Anunna expect us to become? The tablets suggest an answer in fragments. They speak of humans rising to greatness. They speak of the destiny of kingship belonging to humans in future ages. They speak of the seed of the gods growing strong. They speak of mankind ascending to wisdom. This implies a trajectory, a long-term purpose, woven into human nature itself. But this spiritual legacy was not without challenges. The Sumerians believed the soul was influenced by three forces. 1. The divine spark, inherited from the Anunna. Earthly impulses, tied to the body and environment. 3. Cosmic cycles, periods of clarity, confusion, growth, and decline. Humans were caught between these forces. Their task was not obedience, but balance. The Anunna did not create humanity to worship blindly. They created humanity to continue the work of civilization. to preserve order, to cultivate wisdom. Worship was a form of alignment, maintaining harmony between realms, not subservience. This distinction is critical. Later religions would reshape the idea of divine-human relationships into hierarchical structures of obedience. But the earliest Sumerian texts show a different model, a partnership, a shared endeavor between creators and creation. The temples, rituals, and offerings were not appeasements. They were communication, a way to keep channels open between realms. In this worldview, humanity was neither helpless nor abandoned. Humans were apprentices, learning to master the me, the cosmic principles of existence. This belief system profoundly shaped later cultures. Egyptian soul doctrine is almost identical in structure, with multiple aspects of the soul, divine essence, and a journey after death. Greek philosophy echoes Sumerian ideas about the immortal psyche and the divine spark. Indian teachings about Atman, karma, and reincarnation resemble Sumerian concepts of the eternal Z. Jewish mystical traditions, especially Kabbalah, reflect ancient Mesopotamian beliefs about the soul's structure and purpose. Christian teachings about the eternal spirit, divine breath, and spiritual transformation trace their roots back to these earliest ideas. The Sumerian model became the foundation for all future spiritual thought. But there is a more controversial layer beneath it, one that challenges the boundaries of theology and science. The Sumerians believed that the divine spark within humans was not only consciousness, but potential, a latent capacity to rise, evolve, and eventually approach the level of the beings who created them. This idea appears subtly in the myth of Adapa, a human sage created so perfectly by Enki that he nearly gained eternal life. The story suggests the Anunna were both proud and cautious of human potential. They gave humanity wisdom, but withheld immortality, fearing that an immortal race with divine intelligence would disrupt cosmic order. This tension between human growth and divine limits lies beneath many ancient myths. Prometheus gives humans fire, enraging the gods. Adam and Eve gain knowledge, provoking divine intervention. Gilgamesh seeks immortality, but is denied by the gods. The heroes of Greek myth are punished for approaching divine power. These echoes are not coincidental. They originate in Sumer, in the idea that humans were created with capacity, but also with boundaries. So what became of the human soul after the Anunna withdrew? According to the tablets, the soul continued its journey, but without direct guidance. Humanity entered an age of self-discovery, self-governance, and gradual awakening. But the Anunna did not cut the connection. The Sumerians believed dreams, visions, omens, and intuition were remnants of the ancient link, channels through which the divine still influenced human destiny. This leads us to a profound possibility. If the Sumerians are correct, then humanity carries a fragment of the divine, a silent inheritance waiting to be awakened. And that inheritance might be the key to understanding not only our past, but our future. A future the Sumerians believed would unfold in cycles, leading eventually to a return of the divine. In the next block, we explore the final phase of the Sumerian story, the prophecy of return, the belief that the age of separation is temporary, and that humanity will someday stand once again at the threshold between heaven and earth. If the Sumerians believed humanity carried a fragment of the divine, a spark placed within us by the Anunna, then they also believed that spark was not meant to remain dormant forever. Their tablets, hymns, and ritual texts all point toward a single, astonishing conclusion. The era of separation between gods and humans was not the end of the story. It was an intermission, a necessary pause, a cosmic distance established so humanity could grow, evolve, and eventually rise to meet the next stage of its destiny. This belief was not obscure. It was not hidden in esoteric corners of their mythology. It was central, a theme repeated across generations, cities, and eras. The Sumerians believed the relationship between humans and the Anunna moved in cycles. There were ages of closeness and ages of distance, times when the divine walked among humanity, and times when they retreated behind the veil of heaven. But nowhere did the tablets suggest the withdrawal was permanent. Instead, they hinted at an eventual return, a moment when cosmic alignment, human evolution, and divine will would converge once again. To understand this belief, we must examine how the Sumerians viewed time. Unlike the linear perspective of the modern world, the Sumerians saw history as cyclical, patterned, and rhythmic. Just as the moon waxed and waned, just as the rivers rose and fell, just as stars drifted through the heavens in repeating cycles, so too did the destiny of civilizations. The Sumerians identified giant cycles, cosmic periods in which the world changed fundamentally. These cycles were marked by astronomical configurations, shifts in governance, environmental upheavals, and the rise or fall of sacred cities. They believed humanity moved through eras in which divine influence grew strong, then faded, then returned. This idea later appears in Hindu yugas, Greek ages of man, Maya Baktun, Egyptian cycles of Zep Tepi, and even the Judeo-Christian notion of covenants and revelations. But in Sumer, we see the earliest expression of it. One of the most intriguing Sumerian concepts tied to this cyclical worldview was the return of the me. In certain hymns, Anunna speaks of a future age when the divine decrees, the cosmic building blocks, will be renewed, restored, or redistributed. This suggests a resetting or upgrading of human potential, a reactivation of the ancient connection between humanity and the divine. Another clue appears in prophecies associated with Nanna, the moon deity. Nanna was said to rise in radiance during critical ages, initiating new cycles of wisdom. These descriptions are not symbolic. They correlate with the moon's long-term cycles that modern astronomy only later confirmed. To the Sumerians, celestial events were not merely natural phenomena. They were signals of divine activity. But perhaps the most direct reference to the return of the Anunna appears in several texts describing the assembly of the gods. These assemblies occur in two contexts. One, at the dawn of an age, when the gods descend to establish order. Two, at the end of an age, when the gods return to judge, reset, or renew the world. In one such text, the gods proclaim, "We will return when the bonds between heaven and earth are restored." This phrase echoes the earlier moment when the bonds were established, the time when the Anunna first descended. It suggests that a future moment will mirror the past. But what does it mean for the bonds to be restored? The Sumerians believed these bonds were not physical bridges, but energetic alignments, cosmic harmonies between celestial cycles and earthly consciousness. When humanity lost alignment, the gods withdrew. When humanity matured, or the cosmos shifted, those bonds would realign. This belief becomes even more provocative when we consider their astronomical knowledge. The Sumerians tracked extremely long cycles of planetary movement, including the precession of the equinoxes. They believed major transitions in human history corresponded with these cosmic turning points, and they anticipated future ages in which divine presence would return. These ideas did not die with Sumer. The Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians inherited them. Later, so did the Persians, the Hebrews, the Greeks, and the early Christians, each interpreting the prophecy through their own lens. In the ancient Near East, one of the most enduring versions of this prophecy was the expectation of a shining one who would come from the heavens to restore balance. This being went by many names. In Sumer, a returning Anunna. In Babylon, Marduk's second advent. In Persia, the Saoshyant. In Judaism, the Messiah. In Christianity, the second coming. In Islam, the return of Isa. In the Maya tradition, Kukulkan's return. In Andean prophecy, the Inkari resurgence. Different cultures, one archetype. The return of the teacher, the restorer, the cosmic intermediary. Could this be the distant echo of a Sumerian memory? A memory of beings who once descended from the sky, withdrew, and promised to return? This brings us to an even deeper question. What would trigger such a return? The tablets offer several hints. 1. The return occurs during a great cycle shift, a cosmic turning of the ages. 2. It is preceded by social upheaval, environmental change, and spiritual disconnection. 3. Humanity must reach a threshold of maturity, a level of self-governance and self-knowledge. 4. The return is not merely physical but energetic, a reactivation of ancient bonds. In other words, the divine does not return because humanity is weak, but because humanity is ready. And here is the part modern readers may find most startling. The Sumerians believed humans would eventually awaken their dormant divine essence. They believed the spark placed within us, the Z, would evolve, expand, and reconnect with its cosmic origin. This idea appears subtly in the myth of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, where kings compete not in warfare, but in knowledge and spiritual power. It appears in the story of Gilgamesh, who seeks immortality not as a physical state, but as an expansion of consciousness. It appears in the teachings of the scribal schools, where students were taught that writing, mathematics, and astronomy were not earthly disciplines, but sacred paths to wisdom. The Sumerians believed knowledge, true knowledge, was the ladder by which humanity would ascend. But humanity's awakening required a period of separation. Just as a child cannot grow under constant supervision, so too humanity had to stand alone, learning to question, innovate, and explore without divine intervention. This long separation is the era we live in. One day, the Sumerians believed, the cycle would close. Humanity's consciousness would rise. The veil between realms would thin. The bonds between heaven and earth would reconnect. And when that happened, the Anunna would return, not as rulers, not as overlords, but as guides, partners, teachers, fulfilling a promise older than civilization itself. But before we reach the end of this story, we must confront a final, sobering question. Why did the world forget the Sumerians? Why did their language vanish, their cities crumble, their stories become fragmentary, their worldview dismissed as myth? What or who ensured their memory was buried beneath millennia of dust? In the next block, we explore that erasure, the great forgetting, and the possibility that humanity lost more of its origins than we ever realized. Civilizations do not simply vanish, not without reason. Languages do not go extinct without cause. Myths do not fade unless something replaces them. And yet the Sumerians, the first great civilization, the foundation upon which all others stand, were almost completely forgotten for over 4,000 years. Their cities were buried, their language disappeared, their stories surviving only in fragments, echoes, distortions, filtered through later cultures. This disappearance is one of history's greatest paradoxes. How could the civilization that built the first cities, the first writing system, the first legal codes, the first astronomy, and the first cosmology of divine-human interaction fade so completely that by the time of the Greeks and Romans, no one even remembered their name? To solve this paradox, we must examine not only archaeology, but the forces, natural, political, and cultural, that shaped the ancient world. Because the erasure of Sumer was not an accident, it was a sequence of events, each layer burying them deeper beneath sands, conquests, and rewritten narratives. The first catalyst for the forgetting was geography. Southern Mesopotamia is a land built of mud. Fertile mud, life-giving mud, but mud nonetheless. Sumerian cities built of sun-baked bricks instead of stone, slowly melted back into the earth once abandoned. Without granite or limestone to resist time, their structures dissolved into amorphous mounds. If the Egyptians left eternal monuments of stone, the Sumerians left clay, fragile, vulnerable, easily reclaimed by the environment. When their irrigation systems fell into disrepair, the land reverted to marshlands and salt flats. The rivers shifted, channels dried up, cities that once teemed with life were swallowed by silt. By the time Babylon rose to power, much of Sumer already lay beneath layers of earth. The second catalyst was conquest. Sumer was absorbed into the Akkadian Empire, then the Gutians, then the Ur Third Dynasty, then the Elamites, then Babylon, then Assyria, then Persia. Each new power adopted parts of Sumerian culture but rewrote the narrative to favor themselves. Sargon of Akkad, one of history's first empire builders, intentionally blended Sumerian and Akkadian traditions to legitimize his rule. Hammurabi appropriated earlier Sumerian laws and presented them as Babylonian innovations. Later kings did the same. In time, Sumerian became a ceremonial language, then a scholarly language, then a dead language, understood only by priests and scribes. The third catalyst was linguistic displacement. Akkadian, a Semitic language, replaced Sumerian as the spoken tongue of the region. For centuries, both were used side by side, but Akkadian eventually dominated. When a language dies, so too does the worldview embedded within it. The subtleties of Sumerian cosmology became obscured by translations, reinterpretations, and cultural filters. It is through Akkadian, not Sumerian, that later generations encountered the flood story, the creation of humanity, and the tales of the Anunna. Names changed, details shifted, narratives were adapted. By the time Hebrew scribes encountered Mesopotamian stories during the Babylonian exile, they inherited versions already shaped by centuries of cultural evolution. Thus, the memory of Ziusudra became Utnapishtim, and later Noah. Enki became Ea, and later hints of the serpent, the teacher, the guide. Inanna became Ishtar, then Astarte, then Aphrodite, stripped of her cosmic significance. The Anunna became the Anunnaki, then the fallen angels, or the Nephilim, depending on the lens. The fourth catalyst was religious transformation. As new empires rose, so did new religious systems. Babylonian theology elevated Marduk as supreme, overshadowing older gods. Assyrian ideology magnified Ashur. Persian Zoroastrianism reframed cosmic dualism. Hebrew monotheism transformed the many into one. Christianity restructured the entire spiritual landscape. Islam unified much of the ancient Near East under a new revelation. Each new system appropriated, adapted, or rejected what came before. Each removed the older frameworks piece by piece. By the time the classical world emerged, Sumer was a myth itself, a faint whisper inside Babylonian legends. Greek historians heard rumors of an ancient people in the East, but had no names, no dates, no language, no memory. The fifth catalyst was catastrophe. The region experienced floods, droughts, famines, invasions, plagues, and the gradual collapse of irrigation systems due to salinization. The environmental foundation of Sumer, the water, turned against them. Fields once fertile became barren. Populations migrated north. Trade networks faltered. Cities emptied, and then the desert reclaimed the land. The sixth, and perhaps most important, catalyst was the collapse of the written record. Clay tablets break. They erode. They burn. They shatter. They are lost in shifting sands. For 3,000 years, Sumer slept beneath the dust. But the final catalyst for forgetting is more subtle: success. The Sumerian worldview became so deeply embedded in later cultures that its origins became invisible. Their ideas lived on, but under different names. The Sumerians disappeared because they succeeded too well. Their legacy diffused into the foundations of civilization. Their myths became global myths. Their gods became universal archetypes. Their innovations became the baseline of human development. The world forgot Sumer because Sumer became the world. But there is another possibility, one the tablets hint at, but modern scholars rarely discuss: the possibility that the Sumerians themselves expected their civilization to fade. In certain hymns, the gods warn kings that cities rise and fall according to cosmic cycles. They speak of eras destined to collapse, so new eras may emerge. Some texts describe the withdrawal of the Anunna as a precursor to human independence, an age of testing, learning, and eventual awakening. If this is true, then the forgetting of Sumer may not have been a tragedy, It may have been part of the design, a necessary descent into forgetfulness so humanity could rediscover itself without divine intervention, and yet nothing stays buried forever. In the mid-1800s, when archaeologists uncovered the first Sumerian tablets, humanity unknowingly began the process of remembering. For the first time in nearly 4 millennia, the voices of the Sumerians resurfaced. Their words, their beliefs, their histories, their cosmic claims. The rediscovery of Sumer may be more than an academic achievement. It may signal a turning point in the cycle, a reawakening of humanity's oldest memory, the memory of where we come from, and of those who walked beside us in ages long forgotten. In the next block, we explore this rediscovery, the modern revival of Sumerian knowledge, the controversies it unleashed, and the possibility that the Sumerians are re-entering the human story precisely when the cycle demands it. For nearly 4,000 years, the Sumerians were silent. Their tablets lay buried beneath shifting dunes, their temples sank into mud and salt, their names vanished from human memory. Yet when their words finally resurfaced in the 19th century, it was not merely an archaeological discovery, it was a shockwave, a rupture in our understanding of history. Because what emerged from the ground did not fit the story humanity had been telling itself. It began in 1842, when the French scholar Paul-Émile Botta excavated the ruins of Khorsabad. At first he thought he had found Nineveh. He hadn't, but he opened the door. Soon, Austin Henry Layard arrived and uncovered actual Nineveh, then Babylon, then Nippur, then the desolate mounds of southern Iraq. Tablets poured from the earth, thousands, then tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands. At first, no one could read them. They were strange, wedge-shaped markings pressed into clay, a script nobody recognized. Scholars assumed they were a form of ancient Persian or Hebrew, but as more tablets surfaced, it became clear this was something else entirely. Then, in a revelation that stunned the academic world, scholars discovered these tablets represented the earliest writing on Earth, older than Egyptian hieroglyphs, older than Chinese characters, older than any written record humanity had ever known. This script was Sumerian, but the shock did not end there. As scholars began deciphering the tablets, they found stories, long complex narratives of creation, kingship, cosmic order, divine beings, floods, and ancient civilizations. They found law codes older than Hammurabi, astronomical texts centuries ahead of the Greeks, mathematical systems deeply embedded in our modern world, lists of kings stretching back tens of thousands of years, a timeline impossible by current archaeological standards. And they found names: Enki, Enlil, Inanna, Utu, Nana, the Anunna. These names were unlike anything found in later Near Eastern religions, yet they resonated with familiar echoes. The flood story, the creation story, the divine hierarchy, the withdrawal of gods from earth, the promise of return. What scholars had uncovered was not just an early civilization, it was the source code of human myth. The first reaction among the academic world was excitement. The second was discomfort, because the Sumerian tablets contradicted long-held assumptions about the origins of civilization. They suggested history did not progress linearly from simple to complex. Instead, it appeared that complexity arrived abruptly, in full bloom, without a clear evolutionary path. This ran counter to Darwinian expectations about cultural development. It challenged assumptions about human prehistory. It raised questions scientists did not want to entertain. So began the process of selective interpretation. Scholars embraced the tablets containing economic lists, administrative records, legal codes, and astronomical observations. But they grew uneasy, even dismissive, when the tablets spoke of beings descending from the sky, the creation of humanity through genetic blending, kings ruling for thousands of years, pre-flood civilizations, divine councils, heavenly boats, cyclical ages of destruction and renewal. These details, they said, were mythic exaggerations, metaphors created by ancient people who simply did not understand the world. But this explanation had a flaw. The Sumerians understood the world with an unparalleled level of precision. Their astronomical records were astonishingly accurate. Their mathematics was sophisticated. Their legal frameworks were modern in spirit. Their city planning was advanced. Their medical texts demonstrated surprising insight. Why would such a sophisticated people write childish myths about their own origins, unless those myths were cultural memories refracted through time of real events? This question sparked controversy. It still does. Some researchers, often working outside mainstream academia, argued the Anunna were real beings, advanced visitors, teachers, engineers, geneticists. They pointed to the consistent themes across global mythologies. They pointed to the sudden leap of civilization. They pointed to unexplained anomalies in ancient architecture. Others rejected this idea categorically, claiming it undermined human ingenuity. But the tension remains unresolved, because the tablets still sit in museums and universities, unchanging, undeniable. And the more scholars study them, the more the old narratives strain under the weight of the evidence. The rediscovery of Sumer did more than rewrite history. It reopened humanity's oldest questions. Where did we come from? Why did civilization begin so suddenly? Who, or what, guided our early development? Why do global myths converge so consistently? Why did ancient people speak of sky beings as literal presences? Why did their knowledge appear far ahead of its time? The rediscovery ignited new fields of inquiry. Comparative mythology began tracing parallels across distant cultures, uncovering astonishing similarities in flood narratives, creation, stories, divine councils, and cosmic cycles. Archaeoastronomy began revealing the advanced celestial alignments embedded in ancient structures worldwide. Genetic anthropology began discovering unusual patterns in human evolution, sudden expansions, bottlenecks, and inexplicable leaps. Geological research confirmed that massive environmental catastrophes did occur around the time the Sumerians described the Great Flood. Yet even as evidence mounted, conventional narratives held firm, partly from caution, partly from academic inertia, and partly from fear of the implications. Because if the Sumerians were telling the truth, even partially, then the human story is far older, far stranger, and far more interconnected with cosmic forces than modern science allows. But the rediscovery did not stop at academia. As the Sumerian tablets spread into public awareness through documentaries, essays, translations, and alternative research, something unexpected happened. People felt a jolt of recognition. The myths rang familiar. The archetypes resonated. The story felt ancient, not foreign. It was as though humanity had been waiting, subconsciously, to remember. This collective resonance raises a possibility the Sumerians themselves hinted at. Knowledge once forgotten can return when the cycle demands it. Perhaps the rediscovery of Sumer in the modern age is not random. Perhaps it is part of a larger cycle, a reawakening of humanity to its origins, a stirring of the ancient connection between earth and the heavens. If the Sumerians were right, then memory itself moves in cycles. Knowledge returns when humanity is ready, and we may now be entering an age where old truths rise again from beneath the sands. In the next block, we explore how this rediscovered knowledge is influencing modern thought in science, spirituality, cosmology, and even technology, and what it may mean for the next stage of human evolution. Because the story of Sumer is not just the story of the past. It may be the story of our future. When ancient knowledge resurfaces, it does more than challenge historical timelines. It reshapes the present, and the rediscovery of Sumer, with its vast tablets and cosmic claims, has begun influencing modern thought in ways both subtle and profound. Concepts once dismissed as mythology are being reconsidered through the lens of emerging science. Ideas once belonging solely to priests and scribes now find echoes in laboratories, observatories, and philosophical circles around the world. It is as though the ancient memory, buried for millennia beneath mud and time, is rising again, aligning with humanity's growing curiosity about consciousness, origins, and the nature of the universe. And whether intentionally or not, modern research appears to be circling back to the same questions the Sumerians asked at the dawn of civilization. Let us explore the fields where this influence is most striking. 1. Genetics and the question of human origins. As geneticists unravel the mysteries of the human genome, they encounter anomalies that strain the traditional narrative of gradual evolution, sudden expansions in brain size, genetic bottlenecks, rapid cognitive leaps, and most puzzling of all, the absence of clear transitional fossils for the emergence of symbolic thought, language, and complex culture. These anomalies echo the Sumerian claim that humanity was not purely the product of natural processes, but shaped, intentionally, by beings with advanced knowledge of life itself. Of course, genetics does not confirm ancient myths, but it raises questions that myth may have answered long ago. Questions about whether humanity's great leap forward was truly sudden. Questions about the origin of our chromosome 2 fusion. Questions about the curious patterns in our mitochondrial DNA. The Sumerians described humanity's creation with a mixture of clay and divine essence. Modern science speaks of editing, splicing, sequencing, different language, similar implications. 2. Astronomy and the structure of the cosmos. Modern astronomy continues to uncover a universe far more complex and alive than previously imagined. Multiverse theories, higher dimensions, dark matter, cosmic webs, quantum entanglement, the possibility that consciousness itself interacts with the structure of reality. These discoveries resonate with Sumerian cosmology, which described layered realms, hidden dimensions, and cosmic pathways connecting Earth to the divine. The Duku, the sacred holy mound of the gods, resembles descriptions of higher dimensional domains. The boats of heaven, described by the Sumerians, align with modern speculation about interdimensional travel or advanced propulsion systems. Even the Sumerian idea that planets influence human destiny, dismissed for centuries, finds echoes in modern research on gravitational waves, solar cycles, and cosmic radiation's effect on biological life. 3. Archaeology and lost civilizations. As technology advances, so does our ability to uncover the past. LiDAR scanning has revealed massive ancient structures beneath jungles. Sonar has mapped submerged ruins along continental shelves. Geological evidence suggests multiple ancient cataclysms capable of erasing coastal civilizations. Göbekli Tepe, predating agriculture by thousands of years, suggests advanced knowledge existed long before the rise of cities. The Sumerians spoke of pre-flood civilizations, powerful, forgotten, erased by the Great Deluge. Modern discoveries begin to validate the possibility that human history extends far beyond the conventional timeline. As archaeologists explore deeper layers, the line between myth and history thins. 4. Consciousness and the nature of the soul. Neuroscience has advanced rapidly, yet the source of consciousness remains elusive. Scientists understand how neurons fire, how synapses connect, how patterns emerge, but not why consciousness exists, not how subjective experience arises, not how memory can persist across shifting atoms, not how intuition, dreams, and altered states reveal knowledge beyond the limits of logic. The Sumerians believed consciousness, the Zi, originated outside the body. Modern physics entertains similar possibilities. Consciousness as a fundamental field, not a biological accident, a property of the universe itself, something that enters the body and leaves it. Sumerian teachings may be mythic in form, but their implications resonate with the cutting edges of modern science. 5. Global mythology and collective memory. Comparative mythologists continue to uncover startling parallels across ancient cultures. Flood myths, sky beings, cosmic battles, divine descent, sacred mountains, cycles of ages. These parallels exist in regions with no known contact. This suggests either an extraordinarily ancient shared source or a common event imprinted into collective human consciousness. The Sumerians, as the earliest recorded civilization, may have preserved the purest version of this ancient memory. 6. Artificial intelligence and the quest for creation. In an unexpected twist, humanity now finds itself in the position once described in the Sumerian creation myth, crafting intelligence. AI systems are the first forms of non-biological consciousness engineered by humans. We code them, shape them, refine them, just as Enki shaped early humanity from clay and essence. The Sumerian myths may serve as ancient reflections of the ethical questions we now face. What responsibilities do creators hold? What rights does a created being possess? What is the boundary between life and code, between consciousness and programming? The parallels are eerie and profound. 7. Physics and the return of the sacred. As science explores the fabric of the universe, ancient ideas once dismissed as superstition gain new relevance. The universe is not a machine. It is a field of relationships. Atoms are vibrations. Space is not empty. Time is not linear. Everything is interconnected. The Sumerians described a universe of divine order, interconnected realms, and cosmic principles, the me, governing the flow of life. Modern physics now suggests something remarkably similar, a universe built upon invisible laws, frequencies, and patterns. And so, the rediscovered Sumerian story begins weaving itself into our modern worldview, not as proof, but as resonance, as an ancient echo aligning with new discoveries. Which brings us to the present moment. For the first time in millennia, humanity possesses knowledge powerful enough to question its own origins. We can peer into the atom, map the genome, measure the stars, and simulate reality. And as we do so, the Sumerian story, once buried, becomes increasingly relevant. So what happens when humanity finally understands the truth of its origins, whatever that truth may be? What happens when science, myth, and memory converge? Do we face a moment of awakening, a shift in consciousness, a return of ancient knowledge or ancient beings? These questions lead us to one final chapter, the culmination of the Sumerian worldview, the convergence of past and future, the completion of the cosmic cycle, and the legacy the Anunna intended humanity to carry into the ages. In the next block, we bring this story to its conclusion, not an ending, but an opening, a doorway. The story of Sumer does not end in ruins. It does not end in dust, or silence, or the cold vaults of forgotten tablets. It ends, as all great ancient stories do, with a return to the beginning, a circle completed, a cycle fulfilled, an echo carrying the weight of thousands of years, returning to a world finally able to hear it again. Across this journey, we trace the impossible rise of the first civilization. We walk the sacred streets of Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, and Ur. We witness the teachings of the Anunna, beings the Sumerians described not as distant gods, but as wise and powerful visitors who shaped human destiny. We followed the threads of the King List, the flood narratives, the creation of humanity, the mastery of astronomy, the cycles of divine presence and withdrawal. We saw how Sumer's knowledge became the foundation of all ancient cultures: Egypt, Babylon, Persia, Greece, India, the Maya, and beyond. How their myths became the backbone of global religion. How their mathematics still measures our seconds and our circles. How their language faded, yet their ideas survived. We examined the forgetting, the strange disappearance of Sumer from human memory, and the astonishing rediscovery that began in the 19th century. We traced how their worldview now reverberates through genetics, physics, archaeology, mythology, and consciousness studies. And now, at the final threshold, we must ask the question the Sumerians left us with, the question that lingers behind every tablet, every myth, every symbol. What was the purpose of humanity, and where does our story go from here? The Sumerians believed humanity was created with intention, not as slaves, not as accidents, but as participants in a vast cosmic project, one that began long before the flood and continues long after the last ziggurat crumbled. According to their worldview, humanity carries the essence of the divine, something conscious, something eternal, something capable of evolution far beyond the limits of flesh. They believed we were designed to grow, to question, to learn, to rise, not to remain bound to the past, but to move toward a future shaped by awakening. This belief was not naive or optimistic. It was rooted in their cosmology, in their understanding of cycles. The Sumerians saw time as a wheel, not a line, moving through ages of clarity and ages of forgetfulness. The era in which the Anunna walked openly among humans was a dawn. The era after their withdrawal was a long afternoon, an age of trial, independence, and rediscovery. And the future, they believed, would be a dusk followed by another dawn, a new beginning, a return, a convergence of past guidance and future potential. Whether one interprets the Anunna as literal beings from beyond, or as archetypal forces embedded in the human psyche, or as metaphors for forgotten civilizations, their role remains the same. They are the teachers at the threshold, the ones who set the stage, the ones who handed humanity the tools, writing, law, astronomy, agriculture, mathematics, ritual, and then stepped back, allowing their creation to learn through experience. Every civilization that followed inherited fragments of that primordial light. And now, in the modern age, for the first time since Sumer, humanity once again stands at a crossroads defined by knowledge. We peer into the quantum world and discover mysteries older than matter. We decode the genome and find stories written in our cells. We explore the cosmos and see patterns Sumerian astronomers somehow understood. We build machines that think, systems that learn, networks that mimic the interconnectedness of the universe. We move toward becoming creators, just as Enki was described, shaping intelligence, crafting new forms, bridging the line between biology and technology. In this way, the Sumerian story is not merely a tale of the distant past. It is a mirror held up to our present, and perhaps a prophecy of our future. If the Anunna were real, then humanity may be approaching the level of understanding necessary to perceive them again. If they were symbolic, then humanity may be awakening to the deeper truths they represent, the truths of consciousness, unity, and cosmic origin. If they were ancient teachers, then their lessons may finally be reaching their intended maturity. If they were memory, a coded story of early contact, then the cycle of remembering has begun. And so we arrive at the final thought, the one that lingers behind every Sumerian myth, every fragment of clay, every whisper of an ancient civilization lost and found again. The past is not dead, it is sleeping, and we are the generation waking it. Perhaps the Sumerians were not warning us. Perhaps they were preparing us for a time when humanity would once again look to the heavens, not with fear, but with recognition. A time when the divine spark within us would rise to meet the mystery that shaped it. A time when the bonds between heaven and earth would tremble with renewal. A time when the oldest story ever written would no longer be a tale of beginnings, but a guide for what comes next. Because in the end, the Sumerians left us a message woven through their myths, their sciences, their rituals, and their vision of the cosmos. You were shaped for greatness. You were born of earth and heaven, and you are destined to remember. This, more than the cities, more than the tablets, more than the myths of gods and kings, is the legacy of Sumer. Not the ruins, not the dust, but the awakening. And now, the cycle turns again.